What if one of the strangest human mysteries is already moving through your veins right now? A small number of people carry a blood type so rare, so misunderstood, and so surrounded by myth that some have called it a hidden superpower. Not because it glows, not because it makes anyone less human, but because for centuries, blood has been tied to lineage, survival, identity, and fear, and Rh negative blood still sits right at the center of that ancient obsession. It has shaped pregnancy, puzzled science, fueled wild theories, and made ordinary people wonder whether something in their body points to a deeper story. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the truth behind Rh negative blood is far more unsettling and far more human than the legends. The story begins with a substance so ordinary that every human being carries it, and so unsettling that nearly every civilization has treated it as something more than matter. In the dark before laboratories, before microscopes, before genetics, blood is already a language. It stains battlefields and altar stones. It seals kinship, inheritance, sacrifice, oath, disease, and fear. It is the proof that a body is alive and the sign that life can leave in an instant. For thousands of years, people do not understand what blood is doing beneath the skin, but they understand its gravity. They know that when it spills, something profound has happened. They know that family lines are imagined in its flow. They know that rulers claim purity through it, priests bless through it, and stories of monsters and miracles often begin with it. Long before science explains anything, blood is where mystery lives. And because it lives there, because it seems to hold identity itself, human beings return to it again and again whenever they want to explain difference. Why one family prospers while another sickens. Why one child survives and another does not. Why some lineages seem marked by unusual fortune, strange illness, or whispered distinction. The language changes over the centuries, but the instinct remains the same. If something about a person feels hidden, ancient, or difficult to explain, blood becomes the first suspect. It is never only tissue, it becomes destiny, it becomes rumor, it becomes myth dressed as inheritance. That old habit matters, because the mystery surrounding Rh-negative blood does not begin in a modern laboratory, even if the term itself does. It begins much earlier, in the long human tendency to take a real biological difference and wrap it in stories larger than the evidence can hold. A rare trait appears. It seems unevenly distributed. It carries real medical consequences under certain conditions. Most people do not fully understand the mechanism, but they hear enough to sense that something unusual is involved, and from that point on, the imagination goes to work. By the time the modern world gives this difference a technical name, the ground is already prepared. Rarity becomes intrigue. Incomplete knowledge becomes invitation. A small genetic variation begins to look, to many, like a clue to something enormous. To understand how that happens, it helps to step back into older world where blood is never merely biological. In ancient societies, lineage is power. A ruling house does not just own land or command armies. It claims descent. It claims sacred legitimacy. Often through ancestry that is half historical memory and half carefully maintained fiction. Noble blood, royal blood, cursed blood, chosen blood. These are not metaphors in any casual sense. They shape marriage, law, succession, even cosmology. The body itself becomes an archive, one people believe can carry the marks of blessing or doom across generations. When a dynasty collapses, Chroniclers search for corruption in the bloodline. When a hero rises, stories often make that rise hereditary. Even where the evidence remains incomplete, what survives in the record suggests a remarkably persistent idea that blood is the vessel through which invisible forces move from the dead into the living. The same instinct appears far from palaces. In villages and tribal landscapes, kinship systems organize survival. Who belongs to whom is not abstract. It determines obligation, protection, marriage, taboo, alliance, and memory. In many places, blood becomes shorthand for belonging because the body seems like the most undeniable proof of continuity. Families recognize one another in faces, height, skin, disease, temperament, and chance resemblance. Without genetics, without molecular biology, people still perceive that traits travel through generations. They just do not have the machinery to explain how. So they build explanations out of what they can see and what they fear. The result is often poetic, sometimes cruel, and rarely precise. But it is powerful. It teaches people that hidden truths may be buried in inheritance, waiting to reveal themselves in the right child, the wrong marriage, the unexpected birth. This is where the emotional charge of rare blood begins to gather, even before anyone knows what blood types are. Human beings are pattern finders by nature, and rarity exerts an almost supernatural pressure on the mind. When something is uncommon, people do not leave it alone. They assign meaning. A rare stone becomes sacred. A rare birthmark becomes an omen. A rare survival becomes a sign. In time, a rare blood trait will receive the same treatment. Not because the evidence demands that leap, but because the human imagination has always disliked empty spaces. When explanation is partial, story rushes in to fill the gap. And blood, more than almost anything else, invites that rush. It is intimate but hidden. Everyone has it, yet almost nobody sees their own except in moments of injury, illness, or birth. It is inside the body, doing essential work without ceremony, which makes it feel both familiar and secretive. Ancient medicine often treats it as one of the core substances governing temperament and health. Medieval thinkers inherit and modify those older ideas. Across many cultural traditions, blood is tied not only to physical vitality but to character, heat, mood, purity, contamination. Some of those frameworks are elegant errors, some are dangerous misconceptions, and some preserve fragments of observation inside systems that are mostly wrong. But they all contribute to the same enduring impression. Blood is not passive. It acts. It carries. It transforms. By the modern era, science begins stripping away these older symbolic layers, but it never quite eliminates them. Hospitals replace shrines, charts replace omens, microscopes replace inherited lore. Yet the old emotional architecture remains beneath the newer language. People still want blood to mean more than chemistry. That is why even now, in an age of DNA sequencing and immunology, blood types continue to collect folklore. In some places they are linked to personality. In others, to compatibility, temperament, or hidden origin. Most of these associations do not hold up under scientific scrutiny, but they persist because they satisfy a very old need. They make the invisible legible. They turn random variation into identity. Negative blood sits directly in that current. It is real. It is measurable. It matters in medicine. It follows inheritance patterns that can be explained through genetics. But because it is less common, because its distribution is uneven, and because its consequences once carried genuine danger in pregnancy, it begins to attract meanings far beyond what the science can support. Some describe it as unusual in a merely statistical sense. Others reach much further. They speak of lost lineages, superior traits, hidden ancestry, even non-human origins. Scholars still debate many details of ancient migrations and the demographic history behind modern populations, but no serious body of evidence supports those more extravagant conclusions. Even so, the ideas spread. They spread because they offer drama, and because blood has always been one of humanity's favourite places to store drama. Imagine the appeal. A person discovers that they belong to a minority blood group. The result comes in the plain language of medicine, but it lands in a mind already shaped by centuries of symbolism. Rare becomes special. Special becomes meaningful. Meaningful becomes personal. It is only a few steps from there to community, mythology, and self-invention. In a world hungry for uniqueness, a blood marker can become an identity badge. It can offer an answer to the soft modern anxiety of being ordinary. It can suggest that beneath the routines of contemporary life, beneath office lights and traffic and digital noise, there remains something ancient in the body, some trace of an older story. Whether that story is true is another matter, but the attraction is easy to understand. The deeper irony is that the real history of blood is already dramatic enough without embellishment. The scientific discovery that human blood is not interchangeable changes medicine and saves countless lives. The realization that one tiny difference in red blood cells can determine whether a transfusion helps or kills is not a small revelation. Neither is the discovery that pregnancy can become a site of hidden biological conflict, one body reacting to another with consequences that were once devastating and poorly understood. There is no need to invent cosmic ancestry to make this subject compelling. The truth is more human than that, and therefore, in its own way, more unsettling. The body carries differences invisible to the naked eye. Those differences can shape survival. They can travel silently across generations. They can remain unknown for most of history and then suddenly become legible, changing how people understand birth, kinship, and risk. Before that scientific unveiling, though, the mystery exists in a different form. It lies in old family tragedies that no one can explain. It lies in infants lost without clear reason, in dangerous transfusions attempted before compatibility is understood, in persistent beliefs that some lineages carry strange strengths or strange burdens. The evidence remains incomplete when we try to reconstruct how earlier societies interpreted such patterns. But the historical record makes one thing clear. People almost never leave unexplained inheritance alone. They clothe it in narrative. They assign moral or spiritual value to what may simply be biological chance. A hidden marker in the blood becomes a metaphor long before it becomes a medical category. That is why this story is not only about Rh-negative blood. It is about the meeting point between biology and imagination. On one side stands science, methodical and corrective, slowly uncovering mechanisms that had always been there whether anyone understood them or not. On the other stands the human habit of turning uncertainty into legend. Neither side can be ignored if the mystery is to make sense. Strip away the folklore too quickly, and the subject becomes dry. Embrace the folklore too eagerly, and it collapses into fantasy. The tension between the two is where the real story lives. And so the trail begins not with a modern conspiracy, not with a miraculous claim, but with an older and darker inheritance, the ancient belief that blood remembers. It remembers ancestors. It remembers rank. It remembers danger. It remembers who belongs and who does not. Most of those beliefs are wrong in their details, sometimes profoundly wrong, but they are revealing in what they say about the human mind. People look into blood and hope to find a map of themselves. Sometimes they find chemistry. Sometimes they find history. Sometimes they find a mirror that reflects their fears more clearly than their origins. Your negative blood will eventually emerge from that mirror as a measurable trait, a medical concern, a population puzzle, and a magnet for myth. But before it becomes any of those things, it belongs to a much older world, one in which blood is still half biology and half symbol, and where the smallest hidden difference can feel like the edge of a secret. That feeling has not vanished. It only changed its vocabulary. Where ancient people spoke of purity, omen, and descent, the modern world speaks of genes, antigens, and inherited markers. Yet the emotional current is strikingly familiar. A rare sign appears in the body. It seems to divide people in ways they cannot see. It carries consequences no one expected, and almost immediately, the oldest human impulse awakens to ask whether this difference means more than it seems. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because once blood begins to mean more than blood, the path ahead becomes inevitable. Curiosity hardens into theory. Theory invites certainty. Certainty breeds stories that travel faster than evidence. Somewhere between the hospital and the legend, between inheritance and imagination, negative blood acquires its modern aura. To see how that happens, the story must first pass through a moment when science itself enters the scene and discovers, with enormous consequence, that human blood is full of hidden divisions. For most of human history, blood transfusion sits at the edge of desperation, curiosity, and ignorance. It is attempted long before it is understood. That fact alone gives the early history of blood a strange, almost gothic atmosphere. Physicians know blood is essential, know that heavy blood loss brings weakness, pallor, confusion, and death. And so the temptation is obvious. If life drains away through blood, perhaps life can be restored by putting blood back. It is the kind of idea that seems both crude and profound, and in an age before modern immunology, it carries the force of common sense. Yet common sense is not the same as truth. What looks simple in principle turns out to be full of invisible traps. Early experiments are often reckless by later standards. In the 17th century, when European natural philosophers begin probing the body with a new mixture of mechanical confidence and speculative ambition, transfusion becomes one more frontier. Some experiment with moving blood between animals. Others imagine that blood might carry temperament, vitality, even moral qualities, so that transferring it could alter the condition of the recipient in ways extending beyond mere survival. Sheep blood, calf blood, human blood, the categories blur in alarming ways. The boundary between medicine and metaphor remains porous. Blood is still imagined as a fluid that could perhaps soothe madness, restore vigor, or rebalance the body through its living essence. In practice, many of these attempts go badly. The bodies of patients react in ways no one can yet explain. Some die quickly, some worsen mysteriously, some appear to survive, which only deepens confusion because partial success in medicine can be more dangerous than outright failure when the mechanism remains hidden. What survives in the record suggests that physicians are seeing the effects of incompatibility without having any conceptual tools to identify it. Blood is not a uniform red liquid after all. It contains differences invisible to the eye, differences that can trigger catastrophe, but for centuries this remains obscure. The evidence is scattered, the methods inconsistent, the instruments limited. Scholars still debate the precise details of some of these early trials, but the overall pattern is clear enough. Transfusion does not become a reliable therapy because the body is defending boundaries that science has not yet learned to see. That long period of uncertainty is easy to underestimate now. Modern medicine makes blood typing feel almost elementary, the sort of thing printed on forms and laboratory labels with casual confidence. Yet the path to that clarity is difficult, and it depends on one of the most important realizations in medical history. Blood from one human being is not necessarily safe for another. That idea has to be earned. It emerges not from philosophical speculation, but from repeated failure, careful observation, and the slow replacement of dramatic theory with disciplined evidence. By the 19th century, transfusion has not disappeared, but it remains unstable and risky. Doctors know enough to focus more consistently on human-to-human transfusion rather than animal experiments, and this alone improves outcomes. Even so, results remain inconsistent. One patient recovers, another dies. One procedure appears successful under urgent circumstances. Another produces fever, shock, pain, and collapse. Without a framework for compatibility, physicians are navigating a field of invisible mines. Some make technical adjustments. Some debate the method of transfer, the freshness of the blood, the quantity used, or the condition of the patient. All of those factors matter to some degree, but none solves the deeper problem. The body is responding not merely to blood loss or procedure, but to molecular distinctions no one yet understands. Then, at the turn of the 20th century, the mystery begins to break open. In 1900, the Austrian physician Karl Landsteiner makes the observation that changes everything. By mixing blood samples from different individuals and watching how the red cells behave, he notices that some combinations clump together. This agglutination is not random. It follows patterns. Blood is divisible into categories. What looks uniform is not uniform at all. Landsteiner's work leads to the identification of the ABO blood group system, first with A, B, and O, and then with AB shortly afterward. The discovery is elegant in its simplicity and enormous in its consequences. It explains why some transfusions had succeeded by chance while others had failed disastrously. For the first time, physicians have a workable map of one of the hidden divisions inside human blood. The importance of this discovery is difficult to exaggerate. It does not merely improve transfusion. It transforms medicine's relationship to blood from hopeful improvisation into something approaching controlled practice. Once blood groups are recognized, matching donor and recipient becomes possible. The body's violent rejection of incompatible blood is no longer a random tragedy. It becomes a preventable event. At least in many cases, hospitals gain a new level of precision. Surgery becomes safer, trauma care changes, war medicine changes, childbirth emergencies change. Lives that would have been lost to blood loss and incompatible transfusion now stand a better chance. And yet the story is not finished, because the ABO system, for all its importance, does not explain everything. Even after blood typing becomes standard, there remain puzzling reactions. Some transfusions still produce dangerous outcomes despite apparent ABO compatibility. Some pregnancies end in tragedy that the known blood groups do not fully account for. The great revelation has arrived, but it is incomplete. Science has uncovered one hidden layer and now discovers there is another beneath it. This is where the history takes on its quieter, more intricate form. The broad dramatic breakthrough has already happened. Now comes the careful work of noticing what the first breakthrough leaves unexplained. In medicine, those residual anomalies matter. They are the loose threads that, if followed with enough patience, can unravel an entire second mystery. Once physicians and researchers accept that blood has one level of hidden difference, it becomes easier to imagine that it may have others. The logic of the field changes. Instead of assuming unexplained reactions are accidents, scientists begin asking what unseen factors remain undiscovered. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, that question leads back to Landsteiner, now working with Alexander Wiener, in experiments involving rabbits and red blood cells from rhesus monkeys. They identify an antigen that seems related to reactions seen in some human blood. The naming that follows will become historically sticky and somewhat confusing, but the critical point is this: researchers are homing in on another blood factor beyond a BO, one that has real clinical significance. The RH system, as it becomes known, enters medicine not as a romantic mystery, but as the solution to stubborn practical problems. Why does a transfusion reaction occur even when ABO groups match? Why do some pregnancies produce severe illness in newborns? With no obvious explanation under the older model, the Rh factor begins to answer both. Here the body reveals itself as more finely partitioned than earlier generations ever imagined. Red blood cells carry surface markers, and the immune system is attentive to them. That attentiveness is usually silent, a background vigilance keeping the body's internal order intact. But under certain circumstances, especially when blood from different individuals mixes, the silence breaks. The immune system reads difference and responds. That response may be mild, or it may be devastating. The Rh factor is one of the keys to understanding why. For the wider public, however, these scientific discoveries do not arrive all at once as a neat conceptual package. They filter outward over time, entering hospitals first, then medical education, then public awareness, and finally popular culture in a simplified form. Many people come to know blood groups not through the history of failed transfusions or immunological nuance, but through blood donation drives, prenatal care, emergency medicine, or a brief line in a school lesson, a positive, O negative, universal donor, rare type. The terms become familiar while the deeper history remains mostly hidden. That hidden history matters because it explains why a label like Rh negative can later acquire a strange aura. The label sounds small. The path to discovering it is anything but. The discovery of blood groups also changes the cultural meaning of blood in subtler ways. For centuries, blood has been loaded with symbolic weight. Now science proves that blood does indeed contain inheritable differences, though not in the mystical sense earlier cultures imagined. This is a dangerous and fascinating moment. Scientific truth partially validates an ancient intuition, while overturning almost everything people thought it meant. Yes, blood carries markers that differ among individuals and run through families. No, those markers do not encode moral worth, noble destiny, or cosmic selection. But once the public learns that hidden inherited differences exist in blood, it becomes easier for the imagination to reactivate older habits in modern form. Biology, misheard through the echo of mythology, can begin sounding like revelation. That tension is already present in the first decades after these discoveries. Some researchers pursue the science with discipline, mapping antigens, refining compatibility testing, and improving clinical outcomes. Others outside the laboratory begin hearing fragments. Blood has hidden types. Some types are rare. Some pregnancies are threatened by incompatibility. Some populations show different frequencies. In itself, none of this is mysterious beyond normal biology. But facts do not enter the world alone. They arrive among desires, anxieties, prejudices, and fantasies. A genuine medical discovery can quickly become cultural material. Still, the real story at this stage remains one of painstaking observation. There is nothing supernatural in Landsteiner's glassware, in the clumping of cells under controlled conditions, in the pattern that repeats until it can no longer be dismissed as accident. There is only evidence and the disciplined mind willing to trust it. The triumph here is not that science discovers a grand secret bloodline. It is that science learns how to see difference without mythology. It learns how to identify the body's hidden distinctions in ways that protect actual patients, rather than decorate old legends. And yet, for all its discipline, medicine cannot help but inherit the emotional charge of its subject. Blood is never merely another fluid. To work with it is to work at the threshold between life and death. Surgeons know this. Midwives know this. Soldiers know this. Families at hospital bedsides know this. So when science says that blood carries unseen markers capable of determining survival, the statement lands with unusual force. It is factual, yes, but it also reawakens ancient instincts. Hidden marks in the blood, inherited divisions, danger and protection, belonging and incompatibility. The vocabulary is modern, the resonance very old. By the time the Rh factor becomes established in medical practice, the world has entered a new era of biological knowledge. But knowledge does not eliminate wonder, it refines it. The old mystery, once wrapped in sacred symbolism and fatal guesswork, now wears the lab coat of immunohematology. It has become measurable, clinical, repeatable. Yet for ordinary people, the idea remains quietly astonishing. Something inside the blood, unseen and inherited, can shape birth, transfusion, and risk. That is enough to linger in the imagination. The evidence remains incomplete on many smaller historical details of how the public gradually absorbed these discoveries, but the broader arc is unmistakable. Blood first appears as symbol, then as hazard, then as system. What had once seemed like one undifferentiated red essence becomes a landscape of categories and antigens. The body's more specific than tradition imagined, and more complicated than medicine first hoped. The ABO groups open the first gate. The Rh factor opens another. Behind both lies a sobering realization survival has always depended in part on molecular differences that human beings lived among for millennia without knowing they existed. And once those hidden divisions are named, the next step becomes inevitable. People want to know what the names mean, not only in medicine, but in ancestry, in pattern, in identity, in the strange human hunger to turn biology into story. Before that happens, though, the science itself must become more precise. The label Rh negative will enter public awareness as if it were a simple fact, but behind it stands a very specific biological reality, one small absence with consequences far larger than its name suggests. The term itself sounds almost disappointingly plain once it arrives. Negative. 2 syllables of scientific shorthand and 1 familiar adjective, dry enough to sit unnoticed on a medical chart, technical enough to seem self-explanatory. But behind that label is a subtle biological fact with consequences that are anything but trivial. The mystery begins, in the strict scientific sense, not with what Rh negative blood contains, but with what it lacks. On the surface of most human red blood cells sits a protein known as the D antigen, one of the most important markers in the Rh blood group system. If that antigen is present, a person is called Rh positive. If it is absent, the person is called Rh negative. Nothing glows. Nothing changes colour. There is no visible sign in the mirror. Yet this invisible distinction can shape medical risk, inheritance patterns, and, eventually, entire webs of cultural speculation. It is one of those discoveries that reminds science how often the body hides crucial facts in very small places. A red blood cell is already a specialized structure, a compact carrier designed to move oxygen through the body with astonishing efficiency. It has no nucleus by the time it circulates in the bloodstream, no interior drama available to the naked eye. Its significance lies partly in its surface, in the molecular markers that allow the immune system to distinguish familiar from foreign. The D antigen is one such marker. In practical terms, it is a flag. Most immune systems ignore their own flags without comment. But when blood from one body enters another under the wrong conditions, those flags matter. The body reads difference quickly, and once it has learned to recognize that difference, it does not easily forget. That is why Rh-negative blood becomes more than a classification. It represents a distinct immunological position. An Rh-negative person does not naturally carry the D antigen. If that person is exposed to Rh-positive red blood cells in circumstances sufficient to alert the immune system, the body may begin producing antibodies against the D antigen. This process is called sensitization. It does not always happen dramatically in the moment. Often it unfolds silently, as the immune system records an encounter and prepares for the future. The first exposure may pass with little visible consequence. The danger lies in what comes afterward, when the body remembers. A later encounter with Rh-positive blood can provoke a much more serious reaction. That basic mechanism explains why Rh status matters in transfusion and pregnancy. But it also reveals something deeper about how the body defends itself. The immune system is not moral. It does not understand kinship, intention, or the fact that a fetus is partly derived from the mother's own reproductive process. It recognizes patterns. It distinguishes self from not self, according to rules forged by evolution for survival, not comfort. Under ordinary conditions, those rules protect life. Under certain medical conditions, they produce tragedy. The body, in other words, is capable of turning a tiny inherited difference into a matter of real danger without any visible sign until the conflict is already underway. To call Rh-negative blood rare is broadly true, but rarity is always relative. On a global scale, most people are Rh-positive. Rh-negative individuals form a minority, though the size of that minority varies considerably between populations. In some places, the trait is uncommon enough to feel exceptional. In others, it is still a minority, but not an especially shocking one. That unevenness becomes important later, because whenever a genetic trait appears at different frequencies across regions, the human imagination begins searching for hidden stories. But before those stories proliferate, the biological foundation needs to be understood clearly. Rh-negative is not a separate species of blood, not an upgraded or downgraded version of humanity, not a supernatural marker. It is a variation within the ordinary range of human inheritance, one with real effects, but effects entirely compatible with the known logic of genetics. Inheritance is the next piece of the puzzle, and it is partly here that the trait begins to feel more mysterious than it is. Every person receives genetic material from both parents. The presence or absence of the D antigen is determined largely by variations in the Rhd gene, though the Rh system as a whole is more complex than a simple classroom diagram can convey. In broad practical terms, Rh-positive status is usually dominant over Rh-negative status. That means a person can inherit one version associated with presence of the D antigen and one version associated with absence, and still be Rh positive. To be Rh negative, a person generally inherits versions from both parents that result in the D antigen not being expressed. This matters because it allows Rh negative status to move quietly through families, sometimes hidden for generations in people who are Rh positive carriers of the relevant variant. A family may have mostly Rh positive members, and then, with the right combination of inheritance, an Rh negative child appears. Nothing supernatural has occurred. Mendelian logic, population history, and molecular detail are doing the work. Yet from the perspective of earlier societies, or even modern families without much background in genetics, such patterns can feel uncanny. A trait appears unexpectedly. It seems to skip. It emerges where it was not obvious before. The old human instinct to treat hidden inheritance as secret destiny begins to stir again. The evidence remains incomplete in many parts of ancient family history. Of course, no one is reconstructing Rh status from most medieval genealogies or Bronze Age lineages with anything like certainty. But the modern mechanics help explain why hidden traits have always been fertile ground for speculation. Negative blood is not obvious. It does not announce itself through a visible feature in everyday life. Most people learn their blood type only through donation, testing, pregnancy, surgery, or emergency care. Before laboratory medicine, a family could carry such a trait indefinitely without naming it. What they might notice instead are indirect consequences, unusual patterns in pregnancy outcomes, baffling incompatibilities, or the simple fact that some inheritance behaves unpredictably from their point of view. The hidden nature of the trait makes it seem more mysterious than traits that can be seen. This is also where language begins to distort understanding. Negative sounds, to many ears, like absence in a broader sense, as though something essential is missing or lesser. Positive sounds fuller, stronger, more complete. But these are just labels, not value judgments. Rh negative does not mean deficient in any ordinary sense of health or capability. Most Rh negative people live their entire lives without any direct problem arising from the trait itself. The significance appears in relational contexts, in exposure, in pregnancy, in transfusion compatibility. Outside those circumstances, the body functions perfectly well. That point is important, because much of the mythology around Rh negative blood quietly depends on linguistic drift. A technical absence gets inflated into existential difference. And the difference is real, just not in the way popular narratives often suggest. It is real in the immune system's memory, real in obstetric risk before preventive medicine, real in the organization of blood banks that track supply carefully because some blood types are harder to match, real in the quiet logistics of modern hospitals, where the correct label can prevent disaster. The drama here is not cosmic, it is cellular, yet cellular drama can be profound. A single protein on the surface of a red blood cell can mean the difference between compatibility and danger, routine treatment and crisis. In that sense, the story is humbling. Human beings often imagine history in terms of armies, kings, revolutions, migrations, and disasters large enough to redraw maps. But survival can also depend on features so small that they only become visible under modern scientific scrutiny. There is another layer as well. The Urch system is not just one binary switch in the deepest technical sense. It includes multiple antigens and complexities that specialists in transfusion medicine navigate with far more detail than the public usually sees. But the D antigen is the major player in most everyday discussions of Rh status because of its strong clinical importance. That simplification is useful. Yet it can also encourage oversimplified storytelling. Once the public hears that Rh negative is rare and medically important, it becomes easy to imagine that it must therefore carry other hidden meanings. Scholars still debate many nuances in population genetics and the precise historical routes by which different blood group frequencies became distributed as they are. But no single explanation fully accounts for the cultural appetite that forms around one small medical label. That appetite arises from something older than science. It arises from the desire to turn inherited difference into narrative. In practical life, Rh negative status enters awareness through institutions. A doctor mentions it in a prenatal visit, a donor card lists it, a hospital asks for it before surgery. A person hears that O negative blood is especially valuable in emergencies because it can often be given when there is no time to determine a recipient's type. Another person learns that they are A negative or B negative and notices how rarely the term appears in casual conversation. Rarity creates self-consciousness. Self-consciousness invites questions. Questions lead outward, sometimes toward solid biology, sometimes toward unreliable speculation. That branching path is central to the entire modern aura around Rh negative blood. The science is straightforward enough to be memorable, but specialized enough to be misunderstood. That combination is almost ideal for myth-making. The inheritance pattern also gives the trait a curious emotional texture. Because Rh negative status generally requires contributions from both parents, it can seem like the meeting point of two hidden lines. The trait does not simply descend in a dramatic straight path from one striking ancestor. It often emerges from quiet genetic compatibility that has been sitting in the background, unremarked, for generations. In scientific terms, that is ordinary heredity. In imaginative terms, it can feel like a buried message surfacing unexpectedly. Human beings have always been susceptible to that feeling. They see a hidden pattern become visible and instinctively ask what else might be hidden with it. There is no need to mock that impulse. It is part of what drives curiosity in the first place. The same desire to understand hidden inheritance helps produce genetics as a science. The danger lies in stopping halfway, in letting the emotional force of discovery outrun the evidence. Rh negative blood is genuinely interesting. It is worth understanding in precise terms. It tells a story about immune recognition, reproductive risk, population history, and the invisible architecture of biological variation. What it does not do, at least on current evidence, is mark a person as fundamentally beyond the normal human frame. The real power of the trait as a subject comes from how easily a modest biological fact can become a vessel for oversized meaning. For that reason, the most revealing thing about Rh negative blood may not be the trait alone, but the reaction it provokes. People hear that a minority of the population lacks a certain blood antigen and immediately begin sorting that information into emotional categories: unusual, special, vulnerable, desirable, dangerous, secret. The body becomes a stage on which very old dramas are replayed in modern language. Blood once again carries hidden difference. Once again, inheritance seems to point beyond itself. Once again, science gives people a real clue, and many rush to turn it into a revelation. But before those revelations multiply, the map itself needs to be widened. A rare trait is one thing. A rare trait distributed unevenly across the world is another. Once researchers and the public begin noticing where Rh, negative blood, appears most often, and where it appears least, the mystery shifts scale. It moves from the level of the individual body to the level of populations, migrations, landscapes, and ancestral patterns written not in legend, but in statistical traces across continents. Once a blood trait is mapped across populations, it stops feeling merely personal. It begins to look historical. The body, which a moment earlier seemed like an individual biological fact, becomes a fragment of a much larger human story. Negative blood acquires much of its enduring mystique at exactly this point. When researchers and the public notice that it is not distributed evenly across the world, it does not appear at the same frequency in every population, and those irregular patterns are enough to awaken a very old instinct if the map is uneven. There must be a story behind it. That instinct is correct in the broadest sense. There is a story. But the real story is less like a hidden code and more like a long accumulation of migrations, bottlenecks, isolation, and chance. At the global level, Rh negative blood is a minority trait. Most human beings are Rh positive, yet some populations show noticeably higher frequencies of Rh negative status than others. And it is here that the subject begins to leave the clinic and enter the larger theatre of ancestry and historical imagination. Parts of Europe, particularly western and northern regions, have long been associated with higher percentages of Rh negative individuals compared with many populations in Asia, Africa, and East Asia, where Rh negative frequencies are often much lower. These are broad patterns rather than absolute boundaries, and any broad pattern can mislead when handled carelessly. Populations are not pure containers. They overlap, mix, shift, and defy simple categories. Still, the uneven distribution is real enough to require explanation. This is one of those moments where statistics can be both illuminating and dangerous. A map showing elevated frequencies in one region can be read scientifically as evidence of demographic history, or it can be read romantically, as if a hidden ancient people left a biological signature behind them. The first approach leads toward population genetics. The second leads toward myth. Both begin with the same data. What separates them is discipline. Scholars still debate many fine-grained questions about prehistoric migrations and local population structure, but the broad scientific framework is sound. Human genetic traits do not spread evenly because human history itself is not even. People move in waves. Some groups remain relatively isolated for long stretches. Some populations pass through severe reductions in size. Some lineages expand rapidly from a smaller ancestral pool. Over time, these processes can amplify certain traits without requiring any extraordinary origin story. Europe is especially important to the popular imagination here because it is where negative frequencies are high enough in some regions to feel conspicuous, especially compared with global averages. This has made European populations a magnet for speculation, often badly framed. It is tempting for people to imagine that a higher local frequency must point to some mysterious ancestral source, some lost elite, some vanished tribe carrying a rare biological signature. But that temptation confuses concentration with uniqueness. A trait can be more common in one region without being exclusive to it, and it can become more common through entirely ordinary demographic processes: mutation, inheritance, drift, founder effects, and long periods of regional reproductive structure are more than sufficient to generate striking patterns. No single explanation fully accounts for every local variation, but the broad mechanisms are well understood. There is also a quieter truth beneath the statistics. Maps of blood group frequencies are really maps of human history seen through a narrow window. They do not tell the whole story of a people. They do not define identity. They do not mark civilization or character or destiny. They reveal only that populations carry traces of their past in uneven ways. A coastline, a mountain barrier, a migration corridor, a period of relative isolation, a community founded by a small number of people, generations of marriage mostly within neighbouring groups. All of these can subtly shape the frequencies of inherited traits. Blood groups are one way of watching history settle into the body. What makes this especially compelling is that the patterns are not obvious from surface appearance. A traveller crossing a continent might notice language, architecture, food, clothing, religion, climate. None of those would reveal the invisible distributions moving silently through red blood cells. The map of Rh negative blood is hidden beneath the map people usually see. That hiddenness itself contributes to the aura. It suggests there are secret geographies inside ordinary populations, silent inheritances lying under the visible world. In a sense, that is true. Modern genetics repeatedly shows that the body carries layered records of movement and mixture that no earlier age could read clearly. But the existence of hidden structure does not justify fantasy. It simply means human history is written in finer detail than once imagined. Consider how easily uneven distribution can mislead. If one region shows a relatively high frequency of Rh negative status, people may assume that everyone there carries it, or that everyone who carries it comes from there. Neither is true. Populations are made of probabilities, not absolutes. An area can have a comparatively high percentage and still remain majority Rh negative. Another area can have lower frequency overall and still contain many Rh negative individuals because of its sheer population size or local diversity. What survives in the record suggests that public discussion often compresses these subtleties into oversimplified geographic myths. One place gets branded the home of the trait, another gets treated as almost entirely outside it. In reality, human population history is much messier and much more interesting than such simplifications allow. The Basque population often enters this conversation, and not by accident. For decades, popular accounts have pointed to relatively high Rh negative frequencies among Basques as evidence of something singular, ancient, or mysterious. There is a reason this attracts attention. The Basques are already culturally distinctive in Europe, especially because of the Basque language, which has no known close living relative and stands apart from the Indo-European language family, dominant across much of the continent. When a culturally distinctive group is also associated with an unusual biological statistic, the temptation to fuse the two into a grand mystery becomes very strong. Yet here again, caution is essential. A distinctive language and elevated blood group frequencies do not automatically imply a supernatural past or a biologically separate people. They may reflect long regional continuity, relative isolation, and demographic history. The evidence remains incomplete in many fine details, but none of it requires extravagant conclusions. This is the point at which geography begins acting like a storyteller. Mountains preserve difference by limiting movement. Islands compress populations into more bounded reproductive histories. Remote valleys can retain unusual frequencies simply because fewer outside lineages enter over long periods. Coastal zones, meanwhile, may mix repeatedly through trade, migration, and invasion. A blood trait that looks mysterious on a flat modern map often becomes much less mysterious once terrain, mobility, and settlement history are taken seriously. Human history is not just a sequence of events. It is also a matter of how landscapes sort populations over centuries. The body remembers geography even when people do not. There is also the question of time. Modern distributions are not ancient distributions frozen in place. They are the result of countless generations of change. Populations that today appear stable may have passed through conquest, famine, expansion, collapse, marriage networks, and replacement events that shifted local genetic patterns more than any simple story can capture. Scholars still debate the relative weight of particular prehistoric and historic processes in certain regions, especially where the archaeological and genetic records are difficult to align neatly. But the central point remains firm. Uneven distribution is not evidence of mystery in the supernatural sense. It is evidence of history in the population sense. The map looks strange because human history is strange. Once that is understood, our negative blood becomes less a secret badge and more a statistical clue. A clue to how traits drift through lineages, a clue to how communities remain connected or isolated, a clue to the way rare variants can persist, expand, or contract over time. But clues are rarely satisfying to people who want stories with clear heroes and origins. That dissatisfaction is part of why speculative narratives thrive. Demography is true, but it lacks romance for many listeners. A founder effect is explanatory, but it does not feel cinematic. A long history of regional endogamy can account for a pattern elegantly, yet it offers none of the drama of a lost bloodline. The imagination, as always, wants more than the data strictly gives. And still, the data has its own quiet power. It reveals that the human species is both unified and uneven. The same basic biological systems exist everywhere, yet history leaves different fingerprints in different places. No population is genetically simple. No region is biologically sealed. But local concentrations happen, and when they do, they remind us that inheritance is not distributed like rain. It gathers in channels, eddies, and pockets shaped by migration and chance. A negative blood is one of those subtle currents, visible only when measured, but carrying the memory of countless reproductive events over immense spans of time. This is where the subject begins to expand beyond the ordinary individual experience of a blood test result. A person who learns they are Rh negative may first think in practical terms. Is this medically important? Does it affect donation? Does it matter in pregnancy? All of those questions are valid, but sooner or later many become curious about where the trait is more common, what that might say about ancestry, and why some populations carry it more often than others. That curiosity is understandable. It is one of the ways modern people try to reconnect their private biology to the broader sweep of history. The risk comes when curiosity outruns precision. Patterns across populations can suggest routes of inquiry, but they do not grant permission for sweeping conclusions about identity or hidden origin. At its best, the map of a negative blood invites humility. It shows how much of human history unfolds below the level of names and monuments. Conquests leave ruins, kingdoms leave inscriptions, but reproduction leaves frequencies, tiny shifts accumulating generation by generation until later science can detect them. The grand and the ordinary meet here. Every map of blood variation is also a map built from births, families, marriages, losses, and survivals too numerous to remember individually. The landscape of inheritance is made not only by famous events, but by ordinary life repeated across centuries. And this quiet statistical geography has another consequence. Once people see that Rh negative blood clusters unevenly, they begin wondering whether the trait did more than travel. Did it shape survival? Did it impose costs? Did it alter families in ways earlier generations would have experienced as inexplicable sorrow? Because the story of Rh negative blood is not only about where it appears, it is also about what happens when its hidden biological logic enters the most intimate of human relationships. turning pregnancy itself into a site of risk, conflict, and survival. The danger does not announce itself with noise. It begins invisibly, in a place human beings have always imagined as sheltered from conflict. Pregnancy, in most cultural memory, is surrounded by images of continuity, protection, and quiet formation. A body nourishes another body. One life grows within another. The symbolism is ancient and almost universally tender. But biology is not guided by symbolism, and one of the most unsettling revelations of modern medicine is that pregnancy can also become a site of immunological tension, a place where two intimately connected bodies are not, in every molecular sense, the same. Rh incompatibility makes that tension painfully clear. It shows that even within the closest possible human bond, the immune system may still register difference. For most of history, this danger remains hidden. Families know loss, midwives know grief. Physicians know that some pregnancies end with baffling patterns, one child born healthy, another weakened, jaundiced, swollen, struggling for breath, or dead before the cause can be understood. Parents may endure a sequence that feels almost cruelly arbitrary. An early birth survives, a later one does not. One infant appears normal at first and then rapidly declines. Another is stillborn after a pregnancy that seemed, from the outside, ordinary enough. In ages without the tools to detect blood group incompatibility, such tragedies invite every explanation except the correct one. Fate, curse, maternal weakness, bad air, divine punishment, inherited frailty, accident. The real mechanism remains invisible. What survives in the medical record from the modern period reveals how devastating that invisibility once was. Our incompatibility is not a dramatic daily hazard for every pregnancy, nor does it arise in all mismatched couples. The risk depends on a specific combination. Typically, the mother is Rh negative and the fetus is Rh positive, having inherited the D antigen from an Rh positive father. During a first pregnancy, the mother may not yet be sensitized. In many cases, nothing obvious occurs. The baby may be born healthy, but if fetal red blood cells enter the mother's bloodstream in sufficient quantity, most commonly around delivery but sometimes during pregnancy, miscarriage, trauma, or certain procedures, her immune system may begin producing antibodies against the D antigen. From that point on, the danger changes. The body has learned the pattern. In a later pregnancy with another Rh positive fetus, those maternal antibodies can cross the placenta and attack the fetal red blood cells. This is the core of hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn, once one of the most feared hidden complications in obstetrics. The process can vary in severity. In milder cases, the newborn may develop jaundice and anemia. In severe cases, the destruction of red blood cells becomes overwhelming. Fluid accumulates, organs struggle. The fetus may develop hydrops fetalis, a condition so grave that earlier generations often had no effective answer. The child may die before birth or shortly afterward. The sequence is cruel partly because it is patterned, but the pattern is not obvious until science names it. Families can feel trapped inside repeated grief without understanding that the body's own memory is helping drive the losses. There is something especially haunting about that idea. The first exposure may pass almost unnoticed, the maternal immune system quietly preparing itself while everyone believes the danger is over. Then, in a future pregnancy, the remembered difference returns with force. Biology turns prior contact into future risk. It is not malevolence, It is defense operating in the wrong context. Yet to anyone living before the discovery of the Rh factor and the development of preventive treatment, it must have felt like a hidden curse inside the family line, selective, delayed, and cruelly consistent just often enough to terrify. This helps explain why blood becomes such fertile ground for myth. When a condition produces repeated sorrow, in a pattern too subtle for ordinary observation, people look for meaning. Scholars still debate how often specific historical cases of infant loss or recurrent pregnancy tragedy can be reasonably attributed to Rh incompatibility after the fact, because retrospective diagnosis is always uncertain and many other causes are possible. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for earlier centuries when records are sparse and symptoms poorly described, but the mechanism is real, and it almost certainly contributed to suffering long before it could be recognized. Somewhere in the history of countless families, there are losses that medicine can now explain but which once must have seemed inexplicable. The emotional weight of that cannot be overstated. Pregnancy is not merely biological process. It is expectation, memory, kinship, future, inheritance. A child is not experienced as a data point. When pregnancies fail or newborns die, families reach for explanation because grief without explanation is difficult to endure. In many societies, such loss was tragically common for many reasons, from infection and malnutrition to trauma and congenital disease. Or incompatibility was only one thread among many, yet it was a particularly elusive one, because it often hid behind normal appearances until the damage was already done. The mother could be healthy, the pregnancy could seem uneventful, the household could prepare in hope, and still the crisis could arrive. In the modern medical framework, the logic's precise. Maternal anti-D antibodies target fetal Rh-positive red cells. Hemolysis follows. Bilirubin rises. Anemia deepens. The fetal body tries to compensate. If severe enough, the system collapses under the strain. But precise language does not make the reality less intimate. It is still a story about families who could not understand why one child lived and another did not. It is still a story about women who may have blamed themselves for losses caused by an invisible immunological mismatch entirely outside conscious control. It is still a story about physicians confronting patterns they could observe but not yet prevent. And there is another layer to this that makes Rh-negative blood seem unfairly more dramatic than many other inherited traits. In most contexts, being Rh-negative changes nothing obvious about daily life. A person eats, sleeps, works, loves, ages, and dies without feeling any internal difference at all. But in pregnancy, the trait can suddenly matter enormously. A variation that otherwise sits silently in the bloodstream becomes the pivot of risk at one of life's most emotionally charged thresholds. That contrast gives the subject unusual narrative force. Hidden ordinary difference becomes life and death significance under very specific conditions. It is easy to see why the imagination seizes on that. The medical drama is also historically recent in its visibility. Once blood typing and Rh testing become part of prenatal care, the hidden pattern begins to emerge with startling clarity. What once appeared random starts to look structured. Doctors can identify Rh-negative mothers, assess the fetus or paternal status, monitor antibody development, and intervene when needed. The old mystery of repeated neonatal illness begins to yield to explanation. This is one of medicine's most profound transformations, not merely treating visible crisis, but detecting invisible risk in time to prevent catastrophe. Before that transformation, however, the pattern could easily take on the shape of folklore. a family line unlucky in childbirth, a mother thought unable to carry healthy sons, an infant death interpreted through local beliefs about purity, displeasure, vulnerability, or inherited doom. Biology leaves a wound, and culture supplies the story. No single explanation fully accounts for how different societies interpreted such losses before modern immunology, because cultures vary and records are fragmentary. But across many human settings, unexplained reproductive tragedy has often been moralized or mythologized. That is one of the darker habits of history. Hidden medical causes are recast as signs of spiritual failure, improper union, bad lineage, or unseen contamination. Incompatibility, when it operated unnoticed, would have fit all too easily into those older habits of interpretation. The body's molecular distinction becomes, in the absence of science, a narrative about character or fate. There is also a brutal demographic dimension. Before modern interventions, repeated losses could shape family structure in ways both private and statistical. Not every sensitized Rh-negative mother would experience the same outcome in every later pregnancy, and the severity could differ depending on numerous factors. But where the disease struck hard, it could reduce surviving offspring and cast a long shadow over reproductive life. In a world where infant survival already balanced on uncertain ground, any additional hidden risk carried disproportionate emotional force. The household economy, inheritance, care in old age, local reputation, and psychological endurance all intertwine with the fate of children. A blood incompatibility may sound like a laboratory problem. In lived history, it is a family problem, and family problems ripple outward into entire communities. What makes the story even more poignant is that the mechanism is, in a narrow sense, a byproduct of life trying to protect itself. The immune system is doing what it evolved to do: detect unfamiliar markers and prepare a response. In most contexts, that vigilance is indispensable. Without it, infection and invasion would pass unchecked. But pregnancy is biologically unusual. It asks one body to tolerate another that is partly genetically distinct. Most of the time that accommodation is handled with extraordinary sophistication, yet Rh incompatibility shows that the balance is not perfect. The maternal body can become a witness to difference, and once it remembers, the next pregnancy may inherit the cost of that memory. This is where the subject deepens beyond mere rarity. Negative blood is not interesting only because it is less common. It is interesting because it reveals how fragile and conditional compatibility can be. Human reproduction feels ancient and elemental, but it depends on microscopic negotiations invisible to every earlier civilization. The most intimate human continuity is built on biological tolerances that can fail. That realization carries an almost philosophical weight. Life persists not by simplicity, but by immensely delicate coordination. Sometimes a single absent antigen is enough to expose how delicate that coordination really is. And still, even with all this gravity, caution matters. Rh incompatibility should not be exaggerated into constant threat. Modern prenatal care has transformed the situation in much of the world, and even before modern treatment, not every Rh-negative mother with an Rh-positive partner would face the same outcome. Many pregnancies proceeded without severe disease. The science is precise, not theatrical. Yet the historical fact remains that before prevention became available, incompatibility caused immense suffering that families could scarcely understand. It turned hidden inheritance into visible sorrow. That sorrow, more than any abstract statistic, helps explain why rare blood types invite outsized meaning. Once a trait can be linked, however indirectly in public memory, to birth, danger, survival, and repeated loss, it stops feeling neutral. It becomes emotionally charged. It becomes the sort of thing people whisper about, search for patterns in, and eventually begin to treat as remarkable in itself. A quiet biological variation acquires atmosphere, and once atmosphere gathers around rarity, it is only a short step before rarity itself starts to look like significance. Rarity has a peculiar effect on the human mind. It does not merely register as mathematics, it changes atmosphere. A trait held by most people feels normal and therefore largely invisible. A trait held by fewer people begins to glow with implication, even when the implication is mostly invented afterward. This is one of the oldest habits in human culture. The uncommon is rarely allowed to remain merely uncommon. It is elevated, feared, romanticized, or burdened with meaning. A rare mineral becomes sacred, a rare animal becomes an omen, a rare survival becomes a sign of destiny. Rich negative blood. Once it enters public awareness as both medically important and less common, moves almost inevitably into that same psychological territory. It becomes the kind of biological fact people feel tempted to interpret rather than simply understand. That temptation grows stronger because rarity is never experienced in purely numerical terms. Most people do not walk through life reciting population percentages to themselves. They experience rarity socially. It arrives as surprise. A doctor pauses for an extra moment at a test result. A donor learns their blood is especially needed. A pregnant woman is told she requires additional monitoring or treatment because of her Rh status. Someone hears that their type is less common than most of those around them. The trait becomes not a statistic but a small interruption in ordinary identity. It marks the person, however lightly, as different from the majority. From there, meaning begins to accumulate. Modern culture is especially hospitable to this process because it is full of subtle pressures to locate uniqueness inside the self. People are encouraged to identify what makes them distinct, hidden, unusual, special. In that climate, a rare biological label can become strangely attractive. It offers a built-in difference that feels both scientific and intimate. Not everyone understands genetics, but everyone understands the emotional force of being told they belong to a minority category inside the body. Yet negative blood provides exactly that experience. It is not visible, yet it is real. It is not dramatic in most daily contexts, yet it sounds significant. It is inherited, which gives it depth. It is medical, which gives it authority. And it is rare enough to feel personal. The step from rarity to remarkability is small, and once taken, it changes the whole tone of the subject. A person may begin with a practical question. What does this mean for transfusion? Does it matter in pregnancy? Why is my blood type less common? Those are ordinary and responsible questions. But from there it is easy to drift into a different mode of thinking. If it is rare, perhaps it is unusual in more ways than one. If it is inherited, perhaps it says something larger about ancestry. If it matters in medicine, perhaps it matters in character. If it is uncommon, perhaps it is somehow elevated. None of those conclusions follows logically. Yet all of them feel emotionally plausible once rarity has been translated into identity. This is not a new pattern. Older societies did the same thing with lineage, birth signs, unusual physical traits, or improbable survival. What changes in the modern world is the vocabulary. The old language of omens, chosen blood, or hidden descent gives way to a newer language of genes, markers, and rare types. the structure of the thought remains remarkably familiar. A measurable difference inside the body becomes a carrier for stories about what kind of person someone really is. Science is not abandoned. It is half absorbed and then stretched into narrative. That half-understood scientific authority is part of what makes negative blood so culturally durable as a mystery. It sounds grounded enough to be persuasive, but unfamiliar enough to leave room for imaginative overreach. The phrase rare blood type also carries a moral distortion that is easy to miss. Rare begins to sound like valuable. Valuable begins to sound like superior. Superior begins to sound like meaningful in some wider human sense. This chain of associations is psychologically common and scientifically unreliable. Roche-negative blood can indeed be critically valuable in specific medical settings. Blood banks care deeply about maintaining supplies, especially of less common types, because matching matters. A donation from someone with a rarer blood type can be life-saving in situations where alternatives are limited. But medical value in a logistical or emergency context is not the same as human rank. It says nothing about intelligence, virtue, spiritual sensitivity, ancestral greatness, or hidden powers. Yet once the language of value attaches itself to rarity, those farther leaps become easy for the imagination to make. There is also the social power of exclusion. Categories that include fewer people often feel more coherent than they really are because membership itself creates a subtle bond. A large majority trait dissolves into the background. A minority trait invites recognition. People search for others like themselves. Communities form. Experiences are shared. Stories circulate. Some of those stories are medically useful and genuinely supportive. Others drift toward folklore. The trait becomes a center of identity by repetition alone. Once enough people speak of negative blood as special, mysterious, or connected to unusual experiences, the category starts generating its own mythology from within. The evidence remains incomplete for most of those claims, but social reinforcement can make weak patterns feel compelling. The internet magnifies all of this. Before digital culture, rare blood types might remain mostly within the domains of medicine, family history, or local conversation. Online, however, people can find large networks built around even very small shared traits. Negative status becomes searchable, discussable, narrativized. Someone wonders why they have always felt different, then discovers a forum where others with the same blood type describe unusual sensitivities, vivid dreams, strong intuition, sleep disturbances, feelings of alienation, or a sense of hidden ancestry. These experiences are real as experiences in the sense that people truly have them. What is much harder to establish is whether Rh status causes them. In most cases, the evidence does not support a causal link. But once a category exists and people gather around it, pattern recognition takes over. Shared identity begins manufacturing confirmation. This is one reason rarity can become self-strengthening as a mythic idea. The fewer people believe they are part of a group, the more distinct that group feels. The more distinct it feels, the more closely members may watch themselves for confirming signs. The more signs they notice, the stronger the narrative becomes. Soon the blood trait is not just a medical classification. It is a lens through which ordinary human variation is reinterpreted. A common experience becomes significant because the person having it belongs to a rare category. A coincidence becomes evidence. A vague impression becomes a pattern. The body acquires an invisible story and begins to organize perception around it. There is a deeper historical irony here. Negative blood becomes culturally remarkable, not because it is inherently dramatic in daily life, but because modern medicine has made it legible. Before testing, the trait is mostly invisible unless its consequences appear indirectly in pregnancy or transfusion. Once testing becomes widespread, millions of people learn a detail about themselves that earlier generations could never have named. That new knowledge does not remain neutral. People naturally ask what else it means. In a more secular and individualized world, blood type can become one of the many small scientific facts pressed into service as personal mythology. It is not that people reject science altogether. It is that they want science to tell them who they are. Scholars still debate why certain forms of biological identity become more symbolically charged than others, but rarity clearly plays a central role. A common trait does not help much in building a distinctive self-story. A rare one does. Negative blood arrives with exactly the right combination of features to become narratively magnetic. It is unusual enough to matter, ordinary enough to be widely encountered, medically real, inherited, and wrapped in a terminology that sounds both precise and mysterious. It is also connected, however indirectly in popular consciousness, to the primal subjects of birth and survival. That gives it emotional weight far beyond what its statistical frequency alone would justify. At the same time, rarity can invite suspicion as much as admiration. Human societies have often treated unusual inherited traits ambivalently. What is uncommon may be prized in one setting and distrusted in another. A rare blood type can be treated as desirable, fragile, uncanny, or threatening depending on the story being told around it. This too echoes older patterns of thinking. Hidden biological difference has long been a screen onto which people project fantasies and anxieties. The same trait can support myths of superiority, vulnerability, contamination, or chosenness. The underlying scientific reality remains the same. What changes is the emotional script attached to it. This is why it matters to separate rarity from significance without pretending rarity is emotionally neutral. It does mean something, but not everything people want it to mean. It means the trait is less common in the population. It means compatibility requires attention in certain medical contexts. It may point, in a broad statistical sense, toward population history or ancestry patterns when considered alongside many other data points. What it does not mean is that one carries a hidden rank in the human story. The leap from uncommon to extraordinary is one the evidence cannot support. Still, the leap continues to be made because it satisfies a profound appetite. To be rare is to feel interpretable. To feel interpretable is to feel less random. And perhaps that is the deepest force behind the fascination. Human beings are uncomfortable with chance, especially when chance reaches into the body. An inherited blood factor seems like something too intimate to be arbitrary. People want it to point somewhere. They want rarity to reveal purpose, or at least pattern. Yet biology is full of traits that persist not because they confer mystical importance, but because they travel through history according to ordinary mechanisms of inheritance and population structure. The truth can feel less flattering than the myth, but it is not less interesting. It reveals a world in which small differences survive through time without cosmic endorsement, a world shaped as much by contingency as by design. Still, once rarity and identity become linked, the next step is almost unavoidable. If a rare blood type already feels remarkable, then sooner or later people begin attaching specific characteristics to those who carry it. Not just unusual ancestry, but unusual minds, unusual bodies, unusual perceptions. The trait ceases to be a medical label and becomes, in popular storytelling, a personality category. That is where the mythology of Rh negative blood grows more elaborate and more revealing of the modern imagination than of the blood itself. Once a rare trait begins to feel meaningful, people almost immediately start asking what kind of people carry it. The category is no longer satisfied with being biological. It wants a personality. It wants atmosphere. It wants recognizable signs in the mind, the body, the emotions, the strange private sensations people already struggle to explain in themselves. This is where Rh negative blood leaves the world of charts and prenatal medicine and enters a much older human tradition, the building of character from inherited markers. In one era, that marker might be lineage. In another, a star sign. In another, the shape of the skull, a theory now rightly discredited. In the modern age, blood type itself becomes available for the same symbolic work. So negative blood, because it is already rare and faintly mysterious, becomes especially vulnerable to this transformation. The claims vary, but they often follow a familiar pattern. Rh negative people are described as more intuitive, more psychologically intense, more spiritually sensitive, more empathic, more restless, more alienated, more intellectually unusual, more likely to feel out of place in ordinary society. Some stories attach physical traits as well: unusual eye colours, temperature sensitivity, heightened sensory response, sleep disturbance, a sense of electric discomfort around crowds or technology, a tendency toward vivid dreams or precognitive impressions. In more dramatic versions, the list expands almost without limit. The S-negative person becomes not just uncommon, but perceptive in ways others are not, burdened with a hidden awareness, marked by an internal difference that the rest of society cannot quite understand. It is not difficult to see why these claims spread. They offer both explanation and dignity to people who already feel unlike those around them. Many human beings experience phases of estrangement, heightened emotion, insomnia, sensitivity, or the impression that their inner life does not align with the world's surface routines. These are common experiences, though not always easy ones. When such a person learns they belong to a rarer blood group, the category can become a ready-made narrative. Difference in the blood appears to explain difference in the self. The appeal is immediate because it turns diffuse personal feeling into something structured, inherited, and therefore somehow less accidental. The problem is that credible evidence for these specific psychological or spiritual claims is weak to non-existent. Blood type and personality have been linked in popular culture in various parts of the world, especially in simplified ways, but robust scientific support is lacking. Rh status in particular has attracted a dense layer of folklore without producing strong evidence that it determines unusual cognitive gifts, psychic tendencies, or a stable cluster of emotional traits. Scholars still debate many features of how biology and personality interact in general, because human psychology is complex and shaped by both genes and environment. But no reliable body of research establishes Rh negative people as a psychologically separate category in the mythic sense these stories suggest. That does not mean every person drawn to such ideas is foolish or insincere. Quite the opposite. Many are responding to something genuinely human, the need to understand private experience. If someone has always felt unusually sensitive, or chronically difficult to classify, or somehow unaligned with the ordinary social world, they are naturally receptive to any framework that promises pattern. A medical label can feel more legitimate than a purely mystical one, and so Rh negative status becomes a bridge between the two. It offers the authority of biology with the emotional reach of myth. The result is persuasive precisely because it stands halfway between science and self-story. What survives in the record of modern subcultures suggests that these trait lists often expand through accumulation rather than proof. One person describes a sensation or temperament, another recognizes themselves in it, a third adds a new detail. Soon a loose inventory of characteristics appears to define the group. The category begins as blood type and ends as a whole personality mythology. This is how folklore often forms in modern conditions. It does not require a central author. It can emerge from repeated association, especially in communities where people gather because they already suspect the trait means something larger. Selection does the rest. Those who do not identify with the narrative drift away. Those who do remain and reinforce it. There is also a subtle social prestige in sensitivity. Modern culture often treats heightened perception as evidence of hidden depth. To be more affected, more observant, more intuitively troubled by the world can be painful, but it can also feel distinguishing. Whereas negative mythology often draws on that prestige. It frames sensitivity not as mere vulnerability, but as a sign of finer calibration, as though the nervous system were tuned to frequencies others miss. This is emotionally attractive because it turns discomfort into meaning. Alienation becomes evidence of insight. Restlessness becomes a sign of inner range. Isolation becomes proof of uncommon composition. Once that emotional reward exists, the mythology becomes harder to dislodge. And yet the scientific gap remains. Most of the traits commonly attached to Rh negative status are broad enough to describe large portions of the population. Many people have trouble sleeping. Many feel different. Many have unusual dreams. Many consider themselves intuitive, or hope they are. Many pass through periods of emotional intensity or social estrangement. These are not rare states requiring a rare blood type to explain them. They are ordinary features of being human, especially in a world where modern life often feels psychologically fragmenting. The category becomes compelling because it offers an elegant simplification. But elegant simplifications are not always true. There is another reason these legends persist. They flatter the imagination without demanding too much discipline. A person does not have to learn population genetics, immunology, or reproductive medicine to participate in Rh negative folklore. They need only feel that a hidden biological fact might explain their unusual life. The barrier to entry is low, the emotional payoff high. And because the claims are often vague, symbolic, or subjective, they are difficult to disprove in day-to-day conversation. One person's strong intuition is another person's selective memory. One person's special sensitivity is another's ordinary anxiety given a mythic frame. No single explanation fully accounts for why these narratives attach themselves so strongly to negative identity. But vagueness itself is part of their strength. A blurry claim can fit many lives. There is also a curious inversion at work. In medical terms, Rh negative blood becomes important mainly in relation to compatibility and risk in popular mythology. That same status is often transformed into a mark of exceptional internal capacity, a trait associated clinically with vulnerability under certain reproductive or transfusion conditions is reimagined as evidence of hidden superiority. This is a familiar cultural maneuver. Human beings often respond to vulnerability by converting it into mystique. The thing that marks a person as biologically distinct becomes the source of imagined depth or power. In that transformation, medicine loses its precision and folklore gains emotional force. It is worth pausing here, because the distinction matters. People absolutely can build meaningful personal identities around real biological facts. There is nothing wrong with trying to understand oneself through the body. The issue is not identity itself. The issue is causation. Feeling different does not prove that Rh negative blood causes the difference. A rare blood marker can coexist with unusual perception in a person without explaining it. Once correlation is assumed without evidence, the story begins to outrun the biology. The imagination, again, takes a real clue and tries to make it say more than it can bear. Still, one should not dismiss the myth too quickly, because even false or weakly supported stories can reveal real historical needs. Rich negative folklore speaks to a modern hunger for hidden lineage, embodied uniqueness, and scientific-seeming explanations for inner life. It also reflects a broader cultural moment in which many people feel estranged from inherited institutions, but still long for forms of significance that feel older and deeper than everyday identity categories. A blood type offers exactly that sort of significance. It is ancient in transmission, intimate in location, and modern in discoverability. It can feel like a secret from the body itself. This is why the legend of special traits continues to circulate despite limited evidence. It is not only about blood. It is about the unresolved desire to believe that some people carry an interior difference that the world has not fully understood. The label Rh negative becomes a convenient vessel for that desire. It sounds technical enough to escape pure fantasy, but mysterious enough to support endless elaboration. The body becomes a stage for a very old story that unusual inheritance must produce unusual people. The sober scientific view remains narrower. Rh negative status matters because of antigen absence and immune response. It can influence compatibility. It can matter profoundly in pregnancy if unmanaged. It can affect blood donation logistics. It may have population history implications when studied carefully. Beyond that, the evidence grows thin very quickly. Claims of enhanced intuition, psychic sensitivity, or a stable set of exceptional traits remain unsupported. That does not make the cultural phenomenon trivial. It makes it revealing. The mythology tells us more about human longing than about hematology. And once those trait legends have taken hold, the next escalation almost writes itself. If negative people are not merely rare but psychologically or spiritually unusual, then perhaps the difference is not fully human at all. Perhaps, some will say, the trait points beyond ordinary ancestry. From there, the mythology leaves even the edges of respectable speculation and enters one of its most dramatic modern forms, the claim that Rh negative blood is evidence of alien or otherwise non-human origin. By the time the story reaches aliens, the older logic is already in place. The leap is dramatic, but it is not sudden. First a blood trait becomes rare, then rarity becomes significance. Significance becomes personality. Personality becomes hidden ancestry. Once that structure is built, it is only a short distance to the claim that the ancestry in question is not merely unusual, but not entirely human. The alien theory surrounding negative blood does not emerge from laboratory evidence. It emerges from the modern imagination at full speed, carrying with it older myths of chosen descent, secret origins, and superior lineages, now dressed in the imagery of space, genetic intervention, and forgotten contact with beings beyond the Earth. The appeal of this theory is obvious, even when its evidentiary basis is not. It takes an already intriguing biological fact and gives it the largest possible frame. A missing antigen is no longer a product of mutation, inheritance, and population history. It becomes a clue to cosmic interference. A medical distinction becomes a relic of contact. The ordinary boundaries of ancestry are broken open. Suddenly, the person with Rh negative blood is not simply part of a minority category in a blood bank database, but potentially the bearer of an older, stranger story, one that places their body at the edge of humanity rather than comfortably within it. This is an extraordinarily powerful narrative device because it transforms ambiguity into grandeur. One of the most persistent frustrations in modern life is that people often feel inwardly exceptional while living in systems that treat them as statistically ordinary. The alien theory solves that tension elegantly. It offers a reason why someone might feel different, misunderstood, or unusually sensitive. It tells them that the feeling may not be psychological at all, but ancestral in the most radical sense. The world always seemed foreign because, in some tiny biological way, they are foreign to it. The emotional force of that idea is much stronger than its scientific basis, but emotional force often travels farther than evidence. In its more popular forms, the theory usually assembles itself from a few repeated claims, or a negative blood is rare, it is medically significant, its geographic distribution appears uneven. Some people who have it report unusual psychological or spiritual experiences. Therefore, the argument goes, it must not fit comfortably within normal human evolutionary history. Somewhere in the past there must have been intervention, hybridization, or descent from beings not native to the human line. The reasoning sounds dramatic because it gathers real observations and then misuses them. The first premises are partly true in limited ways. The conclusion does not follow. This is a classic feature of fringe theories. They begin close enough to fact to feel plausible, then turn sharply into unsupported territory once the emotional payoff becomes too tempting. The scientific objections are straightforward and, from the perspective of mainstream biology, decisive. There is no credible evidence that Rh negative blood requires non-human ancestry to explain it. Variants in blood group systems arise through mutation, inheritance, and the long ordinary processes of population history. Human genetic diversity contains many traits that vary in frequency and distribution, without any need for extraterrestrial involvement. The absence of the D antigen is well understood within the framework of human genetics. It does not point beyond that framework. No accepted research in immunohematology, population genetics, or evolutionary anthropology treats Rh negative blood as evidence of alien contact or non-human descent. Scholars still debate many details of ancient population movements, but this is not one of the serious debates. On this point, the evidence is not delicately balanced. It is overwhelmingly one-sided. And yet the theory persists. It persists because it is not really competing on scientific terms. It is competing on symbolic ones. The alien theory is a modern myth for a technological age. In earlier centuries, exceptional blood might have been linked to gods, giants, angels, cursed lineages, or sacred kings. In a world shaped by science fiction, space exploration, conspiracy culture, and suspicion toward official institutions, extraterrestrials become the updated version of those older explanatory beings. The structure remains ancient, only the costume changes. Instead of divine descent, there is off-world descent. Instead of spirits tampering with royal bloodlines, there are advanced visitors manipulating genetics. The content feels futuristic. The pattern is deeply traditional. What survives in modern fringe media suggests that Rh-negative blood became especially attractive to this style of thinking because it already carried a ready-made aura. It sounded secretive. It sounded precise. It was obscure enough for most audiences not to understand fully, but familiar enough to feel real. That balance made it ideal material for speculative storytelling. Once online communities, late-night documentaries, self-published books, and conspiracy forums began stitching it together with UFO narratives, ancient astronaut theories, and hidden bloodline traditions, the idea took on a life of its own. In such spaces, weak evidence is not a problem. It is often treated as proof of suppression. The absence of confirmation becomes part of the drama. If mainstream science rejects the claim, that rejection can be reinterpreted as fear, secrecy, or institutional blindness. This is where the theory becomes especially revealing. Not about blood, but about modern distrust. Fringe narratives often thrive where expertise feels distant, bureaucratic, or emotionally unsatisfying. A hematologist can explain antigen expression, antibody formation, and inheritance patterns with considerable precision. But precision is not always what people want. Precision answers the question of mechanism. It does not always satisfy the question of meaning. The alien theory, by contrast, overflows with meaning. It tells a person not merely how a trait works, but why it matters on a cosmic scale. That kind of answer is difficult for ordinary science to compete with, because science is not designed to flatter identity. It is designed to constrain explanation to what the evidence can bear. There is also an aesthetic dimension. The alien theory feels cinematic. It turns a blood test result into a portal. The body becomes an archive of hidden contact, a biological remnant of encounters erased from official history. Modern culture is especially vulnerable to this sort of imagination because it is saturated with stories in which the truth is concealed in plain sight, buried in the bloodstream, the genome, the desert ruin, the classified file. Our negative blood fits beautifully into that visual and narrative pattern. It is invisible but measurable, ordinary but rare, ancient in inheritance and modern in detection. It practically invites a thriller plot. That invitation is part of the reason the theory spreads so easily even among people who do not fully endorse it. It is not just persuasive, it is narratively irresistible. Still, narrative appeal is not evidence, and this is where clear separation matters. No responsible reading of mainstream genetics supports the claim that Rh negative blood is alien in origin. The absence of the D antigen is not a biological anomaly outside human variation. It is one variant among many within a species marked by extensive inherited diversity. If alien contact had contributed materially to the human gene pool in a way large enough to explain a blood group pattern, the evidence required would be extraordinary and multifaceted. It would not rest on one blood marker interpreted through folklore. It would demand genomic signatures, clear mechanisms, corroborating lines of evidence from multiple fields, and rigorous reproducibility. None of that exists. The theory survives because it is culturally useful, not scientifically strong. And yet dismissing it as mere foolishness misses something important. Fringe theories often reveal pressures the mainstream answer has not emotionally resolved. In this case, the pressure is the desire to feel that hidden biological difference must open onto hidden historical difference. If a trait is inherited, unevenly distributed, medically important, and wrapped in unusual stories, many people find it difficult to accept that the explanation might still be ordinary in evolutionary terms. Ordinary, in this context, feels almost insulting. Mutation and drift sound too small. They do not match the magnitude of the feeling, so the story expands until it feels proportionate to the emotional demand. Alien ancestry is not accepted because the evidence is overwhelming. It is accepted because it feels large enough. This is also why the theory often attaches itself to people already drawn to other forms of esoteric genealogy. Rh-negative blood does not stand alone in fringe culture. It is frequently woven into broader systems involving ancient astronauts, Atlantis, biblical bloodlines, suppressed history, psychic gifts, and secret elites. The trait becomes one node in a much larger web of explanatory myth. Once inside that web, Contradictory claims can coexist without much difficulty because the point is not coherence in the scientific sense. The point is symbolic reinforcement. Every unusual fact, real or imagined, becomes one more thread tying the chosen narrative together. No single explanation fully accounts for why this particular blood trait became one of the preferred symbols in such systems. But several forces clearly converge. Its rarity matters, its link to reproduction matters, its uneven distribution matters, its technical label matters. Above all, its partial obscurity matters. Something too familiar cannot carry enough mystery. Something too obscure cannot attract enough followers. Negative blood sits in the perfect middle range. It is known just well enough to feel legitimate and misunderstood just enough to remain open to projection. The deeper lesson here is not really about aliens. It is about scale. Human beings routinely struggle to accept that small biological facts can have meaningful effects without pointing to grand hidden origins. A missing antigen can shape medical history. It can cause suffering in pregnancy. It can leave visible traces across populations. It can attract myth. All of that is already remarkable. But for many people, remarkable is not enough. The story must become enormous, or it feels unfinished. The alien theory is what happens when the hunger for enormity overtakes the discipline of evidence. Even so, the theory does leave behind something worth noticing. It exposes how modern myth-making works. It takes a real marker of difference and amplifies it through science fiction, conspiracy logic, and identity longing until the result feels too emotionally vivid to surrender. The body becomes not only biological, but prophetic. Blood becomes proof of forgotten contact. A medical category becomes a cosmology. And once that cosmology appears, it does not remain isolated. It reaches backward, attaching itself to older myths that long predate UFO culture. Because before Rh-negative blood was linked to aliens, humanity had already spent millennia inventing stories about noble descent, sacred blood, hidden ancestry, and chosen lineages. The modern theory is less a new invention than an updated version of something much older. Long before anyone spoke of antigens, genes, or extraterrestrials, human beings were already building entire worlds out of the idea that some bloodlines carried a different kind of significance. The details changed from place to place, but the structure was remarkably stable. Certain families were said to descend from gods. Certain rulers claimed blood too pure for ordinary marriage. Certain peoples were imagined as chosen, cursed, marked, or set apart by inheritance itself. Even when the language was religious, political, or legendary rather than biological, the underlying thought was familiar. Something hidden moves through generations, and that hidden thing explains why some people are not quite like the rest. Negative mythology did not invent this instinct. It inherited it. That inheritance matters because the modern fascination with special blood is often presented as though it emerged from science gone strange, when in reality it is much older than science. The body has always been one of the main places where society stores stories about legitimacy, danger, and destiny. A king's authority is said to run in the blood. A noble house is judged by the strength or corruption of its bloodline. Sacred descent is imagined as transmissible through birth. In darker forms, entire populations are categorized and ranked through fantasies of blood purity or contamination. The record of history is full of these ideas, and many of them have had terrible consequences. They turn inheritance into hierarchy and biology into moral theatre. This is why modern claims about mysterious bloodlines feel so immediately persuasive to many people. They are not entering an empty cultural field. They're landing on old foundations. When someone hears that a certain blood type is rare, unevenly distributed, and connected to unusual stories, the imagination does not have to build from scratch. It reaches into a vast archive of inherited motifs, chosen lineage, hidden ancestry, noble blood, forbidden mixture, ancient descent preserved against dilution. The modern terminology may be technical, but the emotional pattern is old enough to be almost instinctive. One of the most persistent forms of this older pattern is the belief that power and difference are hereditary in a deeper than visible way. A dynasty may lose territory, wealth, language, or ritual, yet the bloodline is imagined as still carrying some essential distinction. In mythic terms, this distinction can be divine favor, sacred burden, magical capacity, or a right to rule. In more secular later versions, it becomes superior breeding, exceptional stock, or an inherited disposition toward greatness. None of these ideas requires actual knowledge of genetics. They only require the observation that families resemble one another and the desire to turn that resemblance into destiny. Negative speculation fits comfortably inside this ancient habit. The trait becomes one more way to imagine that some lineages contain a buried difference preserved across time. It is not difficult to see how this pattern absorbs modern fringe theories. Once alien ancestry is proposed, it merges almost seamlessly with much older traditions about hybrid beings, heavenly descent, angelic unions, serpent blood, divine kingship, or ancient chosen houses. The names change, but the structure remains. Something non-ordinary enters the human line. The resulting descendants are marked. Their difference persists in hidden form. Ordinary history forgets or suppresses the truth, but traces remain in blood, behavior, or symbolic inheritance. What sounds like science fiction is often mythology translated into contemporary language. The evidence remains incomplete when we try to trace exactly how every modern Rh-negative legend borrows from older traditions, because myths travel in fragments and are often recombined unconsciously. But the family resemblance is unmistakable. Consider how frequently Rh-negative stories drift toward the language of elite descent, ancient priesthoods, lost civilizations, or forgotten rulers. The blood trait is rarely left alone as a neutral marker. It is drawn upward into narratives of old prestige. This is not because the science points there. It is because rare inherited difference tends to attract stories of status. People do not merely want to be unusual. They often want the unusual to connect them to something historically elevated. There is also a darker historical warning embedded here. Ideas about special blood have not only produced romance and legend, they have also justified exclusion, domination, and cruelty. The obsession with pure bloodlines has appeared in aristocratic systems, colonial fantasies, racial pseudoscience, and eugenic projects that treated human value as biologically ranked. Even when modern Rh-negative mythology feels harmlessly mystical, it brushes up against this longer and more dangerous history. Any claim that a minority biological trait makes its carriers fundamentally superior, more evolved, or closer to some hidden truth belongs to a family of ideas with a grim record. The content may sound gentler in online self-discovery spaces, but the structure is still one that history teaches us to handle carefully. At the same time, not every old blood myth is about domination. Some are about survival. Communities under pressure often preserve identity by telling stories of lineage that hold them together across disruption. Sacred ancestry can be a form of continuity. Chosen descent can be a way of surviving conquest, exile, or marginalization by insisting that history has not erased deeper belonging. Blood in such narratives is not merely hierarchy, it is memory. It carries the idea that the past still lives inside the present body, however fragmented the surrounding world becomes. This too helps explain the appeal of arc-negative myth in a restless, globalized, digitized world. Many people long for some intimate sign that they belong to a longer story than modern life seems willing to offer. A rare inherited trait can feel like that sign. This is where the mythology becomes especially revealing. It often says less about blood than about historical loneliness. Modern individuals are surrounded by information, yet often feel severed from deep continuity. Traditional identities may seem weakened, inherited institutions mistrusted, and collective stories unstable. In that environment, a biological marker can become a substitute lineage. It feels older than lifestyle, more solid than personality, more intimate than nationality, more credible than mere intuition. Negative blood becomes attractive, not because it truly restores ancient ancestry in any clear sense, but because it offers the sensation of a hidden thread running backward through time. Older myths also provide a vocabulary of secrecy that modern AH-negative theories readily adopt. The true lineage is concealed. The ruling institutions have forgotten or suppressed it. The bloodline survives in scattered descendants who do not yet realize what they are. These are classic narrative structures. One finds them in religious texts, royal legends, occult traditions, and modern conspiracy fiction alike. The carrier of special blood is not just different. They are part of a story that has been hidden from ordinary history. This secrecy is crucial because it protects the myth from contradiction. If mainstream science does not affirm it, that can be reinterpreted as evidence that the real knowledge lies elsewhere, buried in older traditions or withheld by institutions. Scholars still debate how much ancient societies genuinely believed in biologically transmitted sacred status, as opposed to using it as political symbolism, because the line between belief and utility is often blurred in historical sources. But for the purposes of cultural continuity, the distinction is not always decisive. Whether a bloodline myth is sincerely cosmological or strategically political, it teaches generations to associate inheritance with hidden significance. That lesson lingers. When a modern blood category like Rh-negative appears, it can easily slide into the same symbolic channel. People are prepared in advance to hear that rare blood means more than medical compatibility. There is another important continuity as well, the attraction of partial evidence. Old myths of sacred descent often relied on clues rather than proofs. A strange custom, an isolated people, a line of rulers with unusual marriages, a language no one else speaks, a recurring emblem, a family tradition. These fragments did not prove divine ancestry in any rigorous sense, but they were enough to sustain the story. Modern ARC-negative narratives work similarly. A higher frequency in one region, a medical oddity in pregnancy, a cluster of anecdotal traits, a perceived historical mystery. None of these establishes extraordinary origin. Together, they create just enough texture for the imagination to declare that something larger must be hidden underneath. And perhaps that is the real continuity across thousands of years, the refusal to let inheritance remain merely biological. Human beings repeatedly insist that what passes from parent to child must carry not just molecules, but meaning. The bloodline must encode something about worth, danger, memory, chosenness, or exile. Science narrows many of those claims, but it does not erase the desire behind them. Rus-negative blood enters that desire like a spark entering dry grass. It is real enough to ground fascination and mysterious enough to sustain projection. The sober view, however, requires a different discipline. It asks us to notice the emotional pull of these older myths without mistaking them for evidence. Yes, special bloodline stories are ancient. Yes, modern RH negative speculation is clearly shaped by them. Yes, the recurring imagery of hidden descent, noble inheritance, and chosen lineage helps explain why the subject remains so magnetic, but explanation is not confirmation. Cultural similarity between old myths and new theories tells us why people believe them, not whether they are true. And once that distinction is held firmly, the path back to mainstream science becomes clearer. If Rh-negative blood does not need sacred kings, alien ancestors, or secret lineages to explain it, then what does explain it? The answer lies not in mythic descent, but in ordinary evolutionary processes that, over long stretches of time, can produce results dramatic enough to inspire myth all by themselves. Once the mythology is set aside, the real explanation begins to look both smaller and more profound. Smaller, because it does not require lost empires, extraterrestrial visitors, or sacred bloodlines hidden from history. More profound, because it shows how ordinary biological processes, given enough time, can produce patterns dramatic enough to tempt human beings into inventing myths around them. Rh-negative blood does not need a supernatural origin. It needs only mutation, inheritance, migration, isolation, and chance. Those forces may sound less glamorous than legend, but they are the true architects of much of human variation. They work slowly, silently, and with astonishing cumulative power. At the center of the matter is genetic variation, the same force that underlies all inherited diversity within the human species. Genes are copied across generations with immense fidelity, but not perfect fidelity. Changes occur. Some are harmful, many are neutral, a few can become advantageous in particular contexts, and countless others simply persist or fade depending on how populations move and reproduce. The absence of the D antigen associated with Rh-negative status fits into this ordinary landscape of variation. It is not a rupture in the human story. It is part of the human story. A change arises, is inherited, and then either remains rare, disappears, or becomes more common in certain populations depending on the demographic history around it. That last point matters enormously. A trait does not need to improve survival dramatically in order to become common in a particular group. People often assume that if a genetic feature is noticeable in a population, it must have been strongly selected for because it provided some special advantage. Sometimes that happens, but often frequencies rise or fall for reasons that are much less dramatic. Small populations amplify chance. Isolated communities preserve unusual variants that would be diluted in larger, more connected populations. Migrating groups carry only a subset of the diversity present in their source populations. A trait can become locally common not because it is inherently extraordinary, but because the history of births, marriages, deaths, and movement allowed it to drift upward. This is one of the most important correctives that population genetics offers to popular imagination. A pattern can look meaningful without being intentional. Human beings are used to stories in which causes feel proportionate to outcomes. A striking distribution ought to come from a striking origin. But evolution and demography are under no obligation to satisfy that intuition. Over many generations, minor starting differences can become visible regional signatures. The process is unspectacular moment by moment. No trumpet sounds when a rare variant passes through a family into the next generation. No one notices when a small community, by chance, carries a slightly higher frequency than its neighbours. Yet centuries later, the accumulated result can look dramatic on a map. Mutation is the beginning of the story, though not the whole of it. At some point in the long human past, the relevant genetic variation or variations underlying Rh negative status arose within our species. The specifics are more molecularly intricate than popular retellings usually allow, and the Rh system itself is more complex than a single on-off switch in the abstract. But the broad logic is straightforward. The antigen is absent because of variants affecting the expression of the relevant protein. That absence is inherited. Nothing about this requires outside intervention. It requires only the same genetic processes that have always produced diversity in human traits, from harmless biochemical differences to visible features and medically important susceptibilities. The next force is inheritance, which gives variation continuity. A mutation that arises and is never passed on goes nowhere. A mutation that enters lineages can persist quietly for long periods, especially if it does not impose severe cost on survival or reproduction in most contexts. Rh negative status is a good example of this. Outside specific medical situations, particularly those involving transfusion or pregnancy incompatibility, it does not generally prevent ordinary life. People carrying it can survive, reproduce, and pass it onward. That is enough for a trait to endure. Human populations do not purge every variation that lacks some dramatic advantage. Much of biology is made of traits that simply remain because nothing stops them from remaining. Then comes migration, the great reshaper of genetic geography. Human history is a history of movement, some of it slow and diffuse, some of it sudden and transformative. Small groups split from larger ones. Families move across mountain passes. Communities cross seas. Refuges form during climatic stress. New settlements arise at the edges of the older populations. Each movement takes only part of the original gene pool along with it. In that sense, every migration is also a sampling event. The body of a future population depends on who happened to be there at the beginning. This is not destiny in the mythic sense, but contingency in the demographic sense, and contingency can leave powerful marks. Isolation sharpens those marks. When groups remain relatively separate for long stretches of time, gene flow from outside is reduced. Traits already present can linger and sometimes become more concentrated. Isolation does not have to be absolute. It need only be enough that the same regional patterns are reinforced generation after generation. A mountain valley, an island, a linguistically distinct community, a culturally bounded population, all can maintain slightly different frequencies from surrounding areas over time. What begins as a small deviation can become statistically notable. Again, the process does not require mystery. It requires patience and enough generations for ordinary inheritance to do its work. And then there is chance, which may be the most difficult force for the human imagination to accept. Chance feels intellectually unsatisfying because it seems to deny hidden meaning. Yet in population genetics, chance is everywhere. One family has more children than another. One line dies out. One settlement expands after hardship while another contracts. One small founder group happens to include a higher proportion of a rare variant than the larger population from which it came. These events do not need a deeper design to matter. Repeated over centuries, they can shape the biological character of populations as effectively as any dramatic selective pressure. Genetic drift, as science calls part of this process, sounds technical and modest. But drift is one of the quiet engines of difference. This is where mainstream science becomes more satisfying than myth, if one gives it enough room. Myth offers a grand cause for a visible pattern. Science offers a chain of ordinary processes whose cumulative result is just as astonishing once properly seen. A rare blood trait persists through inheritance. It rises in some populations because of founder effects, bottlenecks, or regional structure. It remains lower in others because demographic history took different turns. The result is a living map of human contingency. No ancient visitors are needed. No sacred bloodline is required. The species itself, moving unevenly through time, is sufficient. Scholars still debate some finer points. Population histories are complicated, and the genetic past is not a perfectly transparent record. Ancient DNA has transformed understanding of prehistoric migration in recent decades, yet it does not answer every local question cleanly. Some regions show continuity, others repeated replacement and mixture. Some modern distributions likely reflect layers of events rather than a single source. No single explanation fully accounts for every local concentration of Rh-negative blood because no human population is the product of one simple event. The real picture is braided. That complexity should not be mistaken for weakness in the scientific account. On the contrary, it is a sign that the scientific account is taking history seriously. There is also a subtle elegance in how this explanation restores Rh-negative blood to the broader human frame. Fringe theories often make the trait seem like an outlier from humanity, a clue that some people stand apart from the species in origin or nature. Mainstream genetics shows something more interesting and more humane. Rh-negative blood is not outside human variation. It is one expression of it. The very fact that such a small molecular difference can persist, spread unevenly, produce real medical consequences, and inspire large cultural stories is evidence not of otherworldliness, but of how richly textured ordinary human biology already is. The temptation to seek hidden advantage also fades under this lens. There is no compelling evidence that Rh-negative status became common in some populations because it endowed its carriers with mystical sensitivity or superior cognition. Natural selection may influence some blood group traits in relation to disease environments, but the evidence surrounding Rh-negative frequencies does not support the larger folklore built around them. Much of what people perceive as exceptional may simply be the human tendency to backfill significance once a rare marker is identified. The marker comes first, the story comes later, and yet this sober explanation does not diminish wonder. It relocates it. Wonder no longer resides in the fantasy of secret descent. It resides in the way time itself works through the body. A village, a migration route, a period of isolation, a sequence of births no one recorded as important. And centuries later a trait shows up on a modern chart as though it had been waiting all along to be recognized. The body is not a treasure chest of supernatural clues. It is a historical archive written in probabilities, and probabilities under the pressure of time can become as evocative as any legend. This matters because once one understands mutation, drift, and demographic history, the map of Rh-negative blood stops looking like a code and starts looking like an echo. Populations do not carry simple messages from the distant past. They carry residues. Uneven frequencies are residues. They tell us that human groups have never moved, mixed, or remained apart in perfectly even ways. They tell us that chance can look deliberate from a distance. They tell us that the line between ordinary biology and apparent mystery is often drawn only by how much historical context we have. And nowhere is that historical context more important than in the regions where Art-negative blood became concentrated strongly enough to attract enduring attention. There, the forces of bottleneck and founder effect are especially visible, and the story narrows from general principles to specific demographic histories, particularly in parts of Europe where the trait's frequency has done so much to fuel speculation in the first place. If the wider scientific explanation provides the grammar of the mystery, Europe supplies much of its most talked about vocabulary. It is here, especially in parts of Western Europe, that a negative blood reaches frequencies high enough to attract sustained notice and persistent speculation. The pattern has been repeated so often in popular accounts that it sometimes acquires a mythic sharpness of its own, as though Europe were the secret homeland of the trait, and everything else only a faint scattering beyond it. The reality is more complicated, but the attention is not misplaced. If one wants to understand how an ordinary genetic variation can become locally conspicuous, then Europe offers some of the clearest examples of the demographic forces already at work in the background of the story bottlenecks: founder effects, regional continuity, and uneven mixture over long spans of time. A bottleneck is one of the most powerful shaping events in population history. It occurs when a population shrinks sharply, whether through climate stress, migration, disease, isolation, conflict, or some combination of forces, and only a smaller genetic sample continues forward. What survives after such constriction does not represent the full range of what existed before. It represents only what passed through the narrow opening. Traits that were once modestly present can become proportionally more important. Traits that were once common can decline. The future population is not built from the whole past, but from a reduced and filtered version of it. Over many generations, that filtering can leave strong signatures. Founder effects are closely related, though they often feel more intimate in scale. A founder population is small from the beginning. A limited number of individuals establish a new community, settlement, or regional lineage, and whatever genetic variants they carry are now disproportionately important. If a rare trait happens to be represented among them more strongly than in the larger source population, it may become unexpectedly common in their descendants. No special advantage is required. The trait does not need to be better, stronger, or more adaptive in any grand sense. It only needs to be present at the right moment in the right number of people, and then to pass through enough generations under relatively stable conditions. Human history contains countless such moments. Most go unnoticed, some become visible only later, when modern genetics and blood typing make them measurable. This is one reason Europe matters so much in the as-negative story. Over tens of thousands of years, the continent experiences repeated episodes of migration, contraction, refuge, expansion, and mixture. Glacial periods compress human populations into habitable pockets. Warmer periods open roots and encourage dispersal. Farming spreads, languages shift, empires rise and fall. Yet beneath all of that historical noise, there are also quieter continuities, communities that remain regionally rooted long enough for local genetic patterns to persist. Europe is not one population, and any attempt to speak of it as biologically uniform collapses immediately under scrutiny, but neither is it a random blur. Its landscapes and histories have created many opportunities for certain variants to become more visible in some populations than in others. The last ice age casts a particularly long shadow over this question. During colder phases, much of northern Europe becomes difficult or impossible for human settlement. Populations retreat into refugia, relatively more habitable areas where people endure the harshest climatic periods. Later, as conditions improve, descendants from those refugial populations expand outward again. Scholars still debate many details of exactly how different human groups moved, mixed, and repopulated the continent across these cycles, especially as ancient DNA continues refining earlier models. But the broad principle is well established. Repeated contraction and re-expansion create ideal conditions for bottlenecks and founder effects. A trait present in one refuge or one expanding lineage can become regionally amplified without needing any mystical explanation at all. This helps explain why local concentrations can arise in ways that later look dramatic. A variant that survives through a bottleneck and then spreads with expanding descendant populations may become more common over large areas, elsewhere. Another population history unfolds and the same trait remains less frequent. Once modern maps are drawn, the differences may look as though they demand a grand hidden cause. In fact, the cause may lie in repeated ordinary demographic narrowing, survival, and regrowth under changing prehistoric conditions. The body carries the memory of ancient stress not as a moral lesson, but as altered frequencies. Western Europe, and especially the Iberian region and adjacent areas, often enters discussion here not because it is magically distinct, but because it has long histories of both continuity and complexity. Populations in and around the western edge of the continent have experienced periods of relative persistence, local differentiation, and later admixture layered over much older foundations. This makes the region fertile ground for unusual frequency patterns in various inherited traits, including blood groups. Popular discussion tends to simplify this into declarations that one people or another has the highest rate, as though that alone solved the mystery. But rates are only the visible endpoint. The real explanatory work lies in understanding how lineages moved, split, and remained partly bounded over time. The Basques return here for obvious reasons. Their language, cultural persistence, and often cited art-negative frequencies have made them the centerpiece of many speculative narratives. But the scientific interest in the Basques is not that they are supernatural or biologically separate from the rest of humanity. It is that they may preserve, in part, aspects of older regional population structure more visibly than some neighbouring groups, while also, of course, remaining fully human and historically mixed in the ways all populations are at some level mixed. The temptation has often been to overstate Basque distinctiveness into absolute isolation or mysterious origin. That goes too far. Yet it is also true that relative isolation, geographic buffering, and long-term continuity can make certain inherited patterns stand out more strongly. What survives in the evidence suggests that the Basque example is best understood not as a riddle outside population genetics, but as one of the clearer demonstrations of how population genetics works. Mountains matter here in a very practical sense. The Pyrenees are not an impenetrable wall, but neither are they irrelevant. Terrain shapes interaction, it channels movement, preserves local difference, slows some forms of mixing while permitting others. Over centuries, even modest barriers can matter if they repeatedly influence who marries whom, which communities remain more connected internally than externally, and how regional identities persist. Founder effects and drift do not require perfect isolation. They only require enough structure for frequencies to evolve unevenly over time. Europe is full of such structure mountain zones, islands, peninsulas, river basins, frontier regions, and enclaves where culture and geography reinforce one another. There is also the question of social structure. Populations are not shaped only by mountains and climate. They are shaped by habits of marriage, language boundaries, religion, class, and local custom. A community that tends to marry within a relatively bounded network over many generations can preserve frequency patterns that would blur quickly in a more open system. These dynamics are often invisible in grand historical narratives focused on kings, wars, and states, but they matter deeply in genetic history. The blood map is built as much by village marriage patterns as by imperial conquests. One of the humbling lessons of population genetics is that ordinary social repetition can leave traces as enduring as famous events. No single European story explains every Rh negative concentration. Some areas may reflect older founder effects, others may reflect later regional structure. Still others may simply show the ordinary statistical unevenness expected in human populations shaped by many layers of migration and local continuity. Scholars still debate how best to interpret some of these patterns in relation to prehistoric ancestry components identified through ancient DNA, and the evidence remains incomplete in places where sampling is thin or later mixing complicates the picture. But incompleteness here does not mean mystery in the supernatural sense. It means the history is braided and not reducible to one clean origin event. This is where the popular imagination often goes wrong. It sees concentration and assumes purity. It sees persistence and assumes unchanged descent. It sees an unusual language or cultural boundary and assumes a hidden biological essence protected across millennia. But populations do not work that way. Even relatively distinctive groups are dynamic. They absorb, lose, transform, and recombine over time. A founder effect does not produce a timeless people. A bottleneck does not create biological destiny. These mechanisms explain frequencies, not myths of eternal separation. Their power is real, but it is statistical and historical, not sacred. Even so, the scientific explanation has its own drama once one looks closely. Imagine a small population weathering extreme climatic pressure in a refuge while the continent around it becomes harsher. Imagine descendants spreading outward when conditions improve, carrying with them a slightly unusual distribution of a blood trait no one can see. Imagine local communities remaining interconnected for centuries, preserving that distribution through ordinary family life. Imagine thousands of births, all anonymous to history, slowly turning a rare marker into a notable regional pattern. There is no conspiracy in this. There is only time, and time in biology can achieve effects grand enough to resemble design. That is perhaps the most important lesson Europe offers in this story. The continent does not prove that Rh-negative blood comes from hidden rulers, alien hybrids, or lost civilizations. It proves that ordinary demographic processes can produce exactly the kind of striking local concentration that later generations attempted to mythologize. The myth is unnecessary not because the pattern is boring, but because the pattern is already fully dramatic in scientific terms. Human beings endured climatic collapse, refuge, re-expansion, local continuity, and endless small-scale social sorting, and the body remembers all of it in ways no chronicler intended to preserve. And yet the historical cost of Rh-negative blood is not only written into these long demographic patterns, it is also written into medicine. If bottlenecks and founder effects help explain how the trait persisted and concentrated, then modern obstetrics and transfusion medicine reveal how societies eventually learn to live with its risks. The next chapter of the story is one of intervention rather than speculation, when a once hidden reproductive danger that had likely haunted families for generations begins, at last, to yield to prevention. For most of human history, arch incompatibility is a danger without a name. Families suffer it, midwives witness it, physicians occasionally glimpse its pattern, but no one can reliably interrupt it. That changes only in the 20th century, when the mystery of blood becomes not just a matter of classification, but a matter of prevention. This is where the story of Rh negative blood shifts in tone. After so much speculation, so much hidden risk, so much grief explained only after the fact, medicine finally begins to do something profoundly human and profoundly modern. It learns how to step between biology and tragedy. The transformation does not happen all at once. First comes recognition. Once the Rh system is identified and its role in hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn becomes clearer, obstetrics changes from observation to strategy. Doctors can now see what earlier generations could not. A woman who is Rh negative is no longer just another expectant mother moving through pregnancy under the old blanket of uncertainty. She becomes someone whose blood type matters in specific and measurable ways. Her care can be adjusted. Her pregnancies can be tracked differently. Risk is no longer an invisible inheritance waiting to reveal itself only through loss. It becomes something medicine can anticipate. This shift alone is enormous. To move from unexplained catastrophe to identifiable danger is one of the most important thresholds in medical history. It does not end suffering immediately, but it changes the structure of hope. Families who once would have had no language for repeated newborn illness now enter a system in which blood tests, antibody screens, and prenatal monitoring begin to expose the hidden pattern. Medicine becomes less reactive and more watchful. That watchfulness is not abstract. It is measured in fewer funerals, fewer baffled physicians, fewer women blamed for losses they could neither foresee nor prevent. In the earlier decades of this transition, treatment remains difficult. Once a mother has developed anti-D antibodies and those antibodies threaten a fetus, doctors must work within narrow margins. Newborns with severe jaundice or anemia may require urgent care. Exchange transfusions, in which the infant's blood is gradually replaced to remove antibodies and excess bilirubin while restoring healthy red cells, become one of the dramatic tools of mid-century medicine. These procedures are technically demanding and far from trivial. They are also, in historical context, astonishing. A newborn who might once have been doomed can now, in some cases, be pulled back from the edge by direct intervention in the bloodstream itself. There is something almost paradoxical in that image. Blood, the substance that once seemed to carry mystery and hidden danger, now becomes the means through which medicine performs one of its most delicate rescues. The same expanding knowledge that uncovered incompatibility also made intervention possible. Yet exchange transfusion, for all its importance, is still a response to damage already underway. It is heroic medicine, but not yet the final answer. The deeper breakthrough comes when physicians realize they may be able to prevent sensitization in the first place. That realization changes everything. If the main long-term danger arises because an Rh-negative mother's immune system encounters Rh-positive fetal red blood cells and then begins producing anti-D antibodies, then perhaps there is a way to stop that immune memory from becoming established. Out of that logic comes one of the great quiet triumphs of modern obstetrics, anti-D immunoglobulin prophylaxis, often known simply as Rh immune globulin. The principle is subtle and brilliant. By administering anti-D antibodies from an external source at the right time, doctors can help clear fetal Rh-positive red cells from the mother's circulation before her immune system mounts its own lasting response. In effect, medicine prevents the body from learning the dangerous lesson. The elegance of this intervention is easy to overlook because it has become so routine in many healthcare systems. But historically, it is revolutionary. A condition that once produced repeated heartbreak can now often be prevented with targeted timing and careful follow-up. An Rh-negative mother carrying an Rh-positive fetus is no longer simply at the mercy of immunological chance. She can be monitored during pregnancy, treated after delivery if the newborn is Rh-positive, and treated after events that may increase fetal maternal blood mixing, such as miscarriage, invasive procedures, abdominal trauma, or bleeding episodes. The hidden trap in the bloodstream is no longer left to spring on its own. It is anticipated and disarmed. What survives in the medical history of this transition suggests a deep and cumulative reduction in one of the old dangers of childbirth. Not everywhere, and not equally. Access matters, infrastructure matters, laboratory testing matters, supply chains matter, trained staff matter. But where prenatal care becomes systematic and anti-D prophylaxis is available, the burden of severe Rh-related hemolytic disease falls dramatically. This is one of the clearest examples of how 20th century medicine changes the meaning of inherited risk. A trait that once cast a shadow over family life becomes manageable through institutions, protocols, and preventive care. The emotional consequences of this change are difficult to overstate. For generations, women may have entered later pregnancies under the weight of prior unexplained loss. Families may have feared a pattern they could feel, but not understand. Physicians may have recognized recurring tragedy without having the tools to stop it. Now the atmosphere changes. Risk is still respected, but it is no longer mysterious in the old sense. It becomes part of a care plan. The hospital, for all its cold surfaces and technical routines, becomes a place where invisible biological conflict can be recognized early and softened before it turns catastrophic. There is also a broader historical significance here. Rh-negative blood is often talked about in popular culture as though its importance lies mainly in mystery. But from the perspective of medicine, its importance lies in the opposite direction in the gradual conquest of mystery. The real achievement is not that the trait inspired legends. The real achievement is that researchers, clinicians, blood bankers, and obstetric teams turned a hidden source of suffering into something increasingly knowable and preventable. The path from myth to management is one of the central arcs of modern science. Negative blood happens to illustrate it with unusual clarity. This progress, however, should not be romanticized into completion. No single explanation fully accounts for the modern global picture, because healthcare systems remain uneven. In some parts of the world, prenatal screening is routine, anti-D immunoglobulin is accessible, and severe Rh-related diseases become far less common than it once was. In other places, shortages, delayed diagnosis, weak maternal care infrastructure, or limited access to transfusion services mean the old risks have not disappeared. The evidence remains incomplete in some regions because surveillance and reporting are inconsistent. But the inequality is real. A medical triumph in one system may still be an unfinished struggle in another. Even where care is good, vigilance matters. Rh status is not the only blood group issue that can complicate transfusion or pregnancy, and the Rh system itself contains complexities beyond the simplest positive-negative distinction familiar to the public. Specialists in transfusion medicine and maternal-fetal care deal with nuances that most people never encounter directly. Yet the central public lesson remains astonishingly simple. A single antigen, absent in some and present in others, once helped shape fates in childbirth. Now a routine series of tests and timely injections can prevent many of those tragedies before they unfold. The history of that shift is one of the clearest reminders that knowledge does not merely illuminate the body, it can change the future of families. There is a quiet heroism in routine medicine that stories of mystery often miss. The laboratory technician confirming blood type, the nurse administering prophylaxis at the correct interval, the obstetrician watching antibody titers, the blood donor whose unit is matched to an infant in crisis, the clinician recognizing when fetal monitoring must become more intensive. None of this looks mythic. None of it carries the glamour of secret bloodlines or cosmic ancestry. And yet this is where the real drama is. The old hidden danger is met not by revelation but by competence. Civilization, at its best, is often exactly this: thousands of careful acts standing between biology and loss. That does not erase the deeper themes of the story. Blood still carries symbolic force. Rare traits still invite wonder. Identity still gathers around biological labels more easily than the evidence always permits. But once one understands the history of Rh prophylaxis, a different kind of respect becomes possible. Rh negative blood is not simply an object of fascination. It is part of a chapter in medicine where invisible incompatibility, once capable of devastating repetition, becomes something humans can outthink. That is not a supernatural power. It is a civilizational one. And perhaps that is the most important reversal of all. The mythology around Rh-negative blood often imagines the trait itself as the source of mystery and power. The medical history reveals something more grounded and more impressive. The power lies not in the blood type, but in the collective human ability to understand it, respond to it, and reduce its danger across generations. The mystery does not vanish entirely, because human beings never stop attaching larger meanings to inherited difference. But the fear changes form. Where once there was only bafflement, there is now protocol. Where once there was repeated grief without explanation, there is increasingly prevention. As that transformation unfolds, the trait begins to move out of the exclusive domain of danger and into a new cultural role. People still learn their blood type in hospitals and clinics, but increasingly they also learn it as part of how they think about themselves. In the modern age of genetics, ancestry and personal identity, Rh negative blood becomes not just a medical fact, but a label people use to build stories about who they are. Once a biological label becomes familiar outside the hospital, it rarely stays confined to medicine. It drifts into identity, and identity is one of the most powerful storytelling engines human beings possess. This is especially true in the modern age, when people are surrounded by systems that classify them in ever finer detail, while also urging them to discover what makes them singular. Negative blood enters that environment as an unusually potent marker. It is scientific but accessible, inherited but intimate, uncommon enough to feel special, and connected to birth, ancestry, and survival in ways that already carry emotional charge. Under those conditions, it is almost inevitable that some people begin using it not merely as a fact about their blood, but as a clue about who they are. The shift is subtle at first. A person learns their type during pregnancy, blood donation, surgery, or routine testing. They note it, perhaps with mild curiosity, then move on. But the label remains available in memory. Later, it may return in a different context: a conversation about ancestry, an online forum, a social media post, a video claiming hidden significance, a friend mentioning that rare blood types are mysterious. Suddenly the old medical fact acquires a second life. It no longer belongs only to practical care. It becomes part of a personal archive of difference. One more detail that can be arranged into a narrative of self. This process is deeply modern. but its roots are older than it looks. Human beings have always used inherited traits to think about belonging. What changes now is the scale and speed at which categories circulate. In earlier centuries, a family legend might remain local for generations. In the digital world, a blood type can become a global identity token almost instantly. People who have never met, who share no language, nation, religion, or local history, can still gather around the same biological label and begin speaking as though it reveals a shared inner condition. That shared condition may be loosely defined or heavily mythologized, but the social effect is real. A dispersed category becomes a community. Community, once formed, generates reinforcement. People compare experiences. They notice overlap. They begin to tell the same kinds of stories. Some of these stories are useful and grounded. Yet negative mothers exchange information about prenatal care, anti-D injections, and what their doctors advised. Blood donors learn why certain types are in demand and how their donations can help. Patients preparing for surgery understand why compatibility matters. This is identity in a practical and constructive form, and it reflects one of the best uses of medical knowledge, not self-mystification, but shared competence. Yet identity rarely remains purely practical. The same community spaces that spread useful information often also spread interpretive meaning. What does it say about a person to have this blood type? Is it related to ancestry in some deeper way? Does it explain why someone has always felt unusual? Does it connect them to certain populations, certain histories, certain hidden stories? These questions are understandable, but once they dominate, the category begins to slide away from medicine and towards symbolism. Rh-negative blood becomes not just a logistical fact, but a source of existential style. DNA culture intensifies this shift. In the modern world, people are increasingly accustomed to receiving small scientific fragments about themselves and turning those fragments into self-understanding, an ancestry estimate, a trait report, a health predisposition marker, a family tree match, a blood type result. All of these can feel like pieces of a larger puzzle. The puzzle is often imagined as identity itself. Negative blood fits neatly into that broader habit because it feels older and more embodied than many abstract percentages in a consumer genetics report. It is not merely information about distant ancestry. It is in the blood right now. That immediacy gives it unusual force. There is also a psychological relief in finding a biological anchor for feelings that might otherwise remain vague. Many people carry a diffuse sense of not quite fitting the social world around them. They may feel temperamentally out of step, unusually sensitive, drawn to older histories, suspicious of ordinary categories, or simply hard to classify even to themselves. These are ordinary human experiences, though not trivial ones. A rare inherited marker can seem to gather them into one place. The body offers a stable reference point where the personality has long felt fluid. Negative blood, in this way, can function almost like a modern totem, a material sign around which a person organizes a subtler sense of self. The evidence remains incomplete. However, whenever people try to move from symbolic usefulness to scientific certainty, a label can be meaningful without being causally explanatory. That distinction is often lost. Someone may truthfully say that learning they were Rh negative changed how they thought about themselves. That is an identity fact. It does not follow that Rh negative status scientifically caused the personality traits, emotional patterns, or life experiences they now place around it. The modern self is especially vulnerable to this confusion because it is encouraged to treat every piece of data as a possible revelation. but data can support narrative without proving it. This becomes even clearer when blood type is folded into ancestry speculation. A person with Rh-negative blood may feel newly connected to certain populations once they learn where the trait appears at higher frequencies. That curiosity can be productive if it leads toward real historical learning about migration, demography, and regional population patterns. But it can also become oversimplified very quickly. A blood type is only one small piece of biological information. It cannot by itself reconstruct a meaningful ancestry profile, still less establish membership in some romanticized ancient lineage. Yet because it is inherited and emotionally resonant, it is often treated as though it carries far more historical specificity than it really does. There is also a strange prestige attached to embodied mystery in the age of algorithms. So much of modern life feels externalized, tracked, and flattened into visible profiles that people hunger for something inward and hidden that still belongs only to them. Renegative blood offers that feeling. It is internal. It is not obvious to strangers. It sounds technical. It is medically real. And because many people around them may not know their own Rh status, the information can feel almost initiatory, a detail that quietly separates the informed self from the unknowing crowd. The trait may have no visible effect in daily life, but identity often thrives on exactly such invisible distinctions. Scholars still debate how much of contemporary identity building around biology should be understood as empowerment and how much as a new form of self-essentialism. The tendency to reduce personhood to inherited markers. Rh-negative blood makes that tension visible in miniature. On one hand, knowing one's blood type can be genuinely useful, grounding, and even life-saving in medical contexts. On the other hand, it can become a trap if the label hardens into a fixed theory of the self. A person may begin to interpret too much through it, to confuse a blood marker with destiny, to flatten the complexity of experience into one inherited sign. The category promises depth, but if handled rigidly, it can actually narrow the self rather than expand it. Still, it would be a mistake to dismiss the identity dimension altogether. Humans are meaning-making creatures, and biological knowledge does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives in lives already full of memory, longing, family stories, and unanswered questions. If someone has grown up hearing fragments about ancestry, sensing hidden tensions in kinship, or simply wanting a stronger thread to the past, a blood type can become one of the available threads. It may not be the strongest one scientifically, but it is one of the most emotionally vivid. Blood has always held that place. Even when modern science strips away older myths, the emotional authority of blood remains stubbornly intact. This is why Rh-negative identity continues to circulate even among people who do not believe the more extravagant theories. They may reject aliens, secret bloodlines, and psychic trait lists, yet still feel that the label matters. Perhaps it makes them more attentive to family history. Perhaps it became important during pregnancy. Perhaps it deepened their interest in how invisible, biological differences shape human lives. Perhaps it simply gave them a stable fact about themselves in a world where many identities feel negotiable. None of that is irrational. The issue is not whether the label can matter personally. The issue is how much meaning one asks it to carry. And this is where the subject becomes most revealing. Rh-negative blood is not just a matter of immunology or folklore. It is also a case study in how modern people use fragments of science to build personal meaning. They do not only ask, "What is this?" They ask, "What does this make me?" That second question has no simple scientific answer. It belongs partly to culture, partly to psychology, partly to history and partly to the old human tendency to seek self-recognition in inherited signs. By now, the category has travelled a long way from the clinic. It has become a symbol, a shorthand, a social identity, a minor mystery people can carry privately inside ordinary life. And once a symbol reaches that point, it becomes very difficult to retire, even when the science is clear, even when the strongest claims are unsupported. The fascination remains, because the fascination was never only about blood. It was about what blood seems to promise, an intimate secret that might explain why some people feel different and where that difference might have come from. That promise is exactly why the mystery endures, not because the evidence points to hidden powers or non-human ancestry, but because rarity, uncertainty, and the language of concealed difference are enough to keep the imagination alive long after the science has spoken. Mysteries do not survive because evidence is strong. They survive because they satisfy something. Evidence alone often cannot. By the time art-negative blood reaches the modern imagination in full, the science is already substantial. Its inheritance can be explained. Its medical relevance is well understood. Its uneven distribution across populations fits within ordinary population genetics. The extravagant claims have weak foundations, and yet the fascination continues. It continues in books, videos, forums, conversations, family stories, and private acts of self-interpretation. It continues because art-negative blood sits at the exact crossing point where human beings are least willing to remain purely factual rarity, ancestry, identity, birth, and hidden difference. Few subjects are better designed to outlive their own explanation. Part of the endurance comes from language. The phrase itself still carries a charge. Negative sounds like a technical code with something withheld inside it. It suggests a missing piece, an invisible subtraction. Even for people who know the biology, the label retains a certain chill. Negative is merely descriptive in medical terms, but in ordinary language it sounds exceptional, perhaps even ominous. The effect is subtle but powerful. A person is not simply type A or they are a negative, O negative, a B negative. The category feels sharper, more marked. Words matter because they create the emotional atmosphere in which facts are received. Rh-negative blood does not only function as a scientific description, it also arrives as a mood. Then there is rarity, which never quite stops exerting pressure on the imagination. The human mind is not good at leaving uncommon things alone. Once something is known to be less frequent, it begins attracting questions that more common traits never have to answer. Why is it rarer? Where did it come from? Does it mean something else? Does it connect people who have it? Could there be some hidden significance not yet understood? These questions would exist even if the trait had no medical consequences at all, because it does have medical consequences in certain contexts. The curiosity becomes even harder to contain. The body has already confirmed that the difference matters somewhere. That alone makes people wonder where else it might matter. Uncertainty also plays a decisive role. The scientific picture is strong, but it is not the kind of knowledge most people carry in detail. They know fragments. Art-negative is less common. It can matter in pregnancy. It has something to do with compatibility. It appears more often in some populations. Most do not move much further than that. The space between fragmentary understanding and full explanation is exactly where folklore flourishes. It is enough knowledge to feel grounded and not enough knowledge to feel closed. The evidence remains incomplete, not in the scientific sense that the central mechanism is unknown, but in the public sense that many people only receive the edges of the subject. In that partial light, mystery remains comfortable. The internet has made this partial light condition almost permanent. Information arrives broken into claims, clips, posts, anecdotes, and repeated fragments, rarely in the slow and disciplined structure that a textbook or specialist training would provide. A person searching for Rh-negative blood online is likely to encounter medical facts, donor information, pregnancy guidance, population maps, fringe theories, personal testimonies, and mystical speculation all crowded together. The result is not clarity but atmosphere. The category begins to feel larger than any single explanation because so many incompatible explanations coexist around it. This does not merely preserve the mystery, it industrializes it. There is also the emotional authority of testimony. Scientific literature works through data, controls, replication, and statistical caution. Human beings, however, are strongly moved by the single vivid account. Someone says they are Rh negative and have always felt unusual. Someone else says their family has a long history of strange intuition, vivid dreams, or reproductive complications. Another person claims the blood type connects them to a region, a forgotten ancestry, a feeling of distance from ordinary life. None of these accounts proves a wider theory, but proof is not always what gives stories staying power. A well-told personal account can anchor a myth more firmly than 100 careful corrections, especially when the myth offers a flattering or consoling interpretation. The enduring mystery also reveals something about modern loneliness. People increasingly live in societies where large collective identities have weakened or fragmented, yet the hunger for deep belonging remains. Rh-negative blood offers an unusual form of belonging because it feels both collective and secretive. One belongs to a minority category, but not one immediately visible in public life. It is not like nationality, class, or profession. It is interior. This gives it the emotional quality of hidden membership. Hidden memberships have always been magnetically attractive. They make the individual feel both connected and distinct at once. Rh-negative blood does exactly that. It creates a private bridge between uniqueness and community. And then there is ancestry, perhaps the most enduring engine of all. The modern world is crowded with people trying to reconstruct where they come from, often from fragments. Family migration has blurred local memories. Oral traditions have broken, surnames have shifted, nations have changed borders, archives are incomplete. Consumer DNA testing has only intensified the desire to find stable markers that tie a person to a longer story. In that environment, a rare blood type can feel like one more clue from the body, one more sign that identity is not just social performance, but buried continuity. That feeling is not trivial, but it can easily outrun what the evidence can responsibly say. A blood type is not a family chronicle. It is a trace, and traces are often overread when the hunger for origin is strong. Scholars still debate why certain scientific facts become culturally enchanted while others remain dry. Rh-negative blood seems to have been enchanted because it touches too many charged human themes at once. If it were only rare, it might remain a curiosity. If it were only medically relevant, it might stay in hospitals. If it were only unevenly distributed, it might belong mostly to population genetics. But it is rare and medically important and inherited and tied to pregnancy and distributed unevenly and linguistically suggestive. Each element amplifies the others. Together they form an almost perfect machine for sustained fascination. No single explanation fully accounts for why some people become intensely drawn to the subject, while others barely notice it. Personality matters, culture matters, prior beliefs matter. A person already interested in hidden ancestry or alternative history will approach the label differently from someone encountering it during routine prenatal care. But across those differences, the same basic structure appears again and again. Rh negative blood suggests that not all differences are visible. It suggests that the body may be carrying a fact about the self more ancient and intimate than ordinary identity categories reveal. Once that suggestion is felt, it is very difficult to return entirely to the cooler language of antigens and inheritance. This is where mainstream science sometimes struggles, not because it is wrong, but because it is emotionally modest. Science can say what Rh negative blood is, how it is inherited, why it matters in medicine, and how its distribution likely arose through ordinary demographic history. What science does not do, at least not by itself, is turn that knowledge into a satisfying personal myth. People often ask from biological facts not only explanation but significance. They want the body to speak in the language of meaning. Whereas negative blood becomes a mystery that endures because it offers just enough biological reality to support that hope without ever fully settling it. There is a quiet irony in this. The better science explains the trait, the more clearly we can see that the mystery is not located in the blood alone. It is located in the human response to hidden difference. Give people one invisible inherited variation with real stakes, and many will build around it a theory of self, ancestry, and destiny. The same mechanism appears in countless other settings, but blood intensifies it because blood has never been merely physiological in human thought. It carries old symbolic weight even when spoken of in laboratory terms. The ancient atmosphere survives inside the modern label. In that sense, the endurance of the mystery is not a failure of knowledge. It is a reminder that knowledge and myth often coexist rather than replacing one another cleanly. A doctor may understand Rh incompatibility perfectly and still feel the old emotional force of blood as inheritance. A patient may accept the medical facts and still privately wonder whether the trait says something more. A donor may know the logistics of blood supply and still feel marked in some subtle way by rarity. Human beings are capable of holding mechanism and symbolism at the same time. Where negative blood persists as a fascination because it lives precisely in that overlap. And perhaps that overlap is the real subject. Not whether the trait hides a cosmic secret, but why we so readily hope it does. Why a small biological difference becomes an invitation to enlarge the self. Why incomplete public knowledge keeps opening the door to extravagant narratives. Why the ancient symbolic gravity of blood has survived all the way into the age of molecular medicine. The answer is not that the science is too weak. The answer is that the human appetite for meaning is too strong to leave a charged fact alone. So the mystery endures, not as proof of hidden powers, but as proof of a deeper tendency. We are drawn to differences we cannot see. We attach story to rarity. We search the body for confirmation that identity runs deeper than circumstance. Our negative blood continues to fascinate because it gives that search a precise, inherited, medically real point of focus. The question is no longer whether the trait is mysterious in itself. The question is what our fascination with it reveals about us. And what it reveals, in the end, is not a secret species or a forgotten intervention, but something more familiar and more enduring. A small marker in the blood becomes a larger mirror, reflecting human evolution, fear, survival, longing, and imagination back at us with unusual clarity. In the end, the most revealing thing about Rh-negative blood is not that it points beyond humanity, but that it points so deeply into it. Strip away the cosmic theories, the secret bloodline fantasies, the modern folklore of special traits, and what remains is still remarkably rich. A small molecular distinction, invisible to the eye, travels through generations and shapes real human outcomes. It appears unevenly across populations because history itself has been uneven. It once contributed to tragedies in pregnancy that families could scarcely understand. It later became manageable through one of the quieter triumphs of modern medicine, and along the way it gathered around itself a fog of longing, projection, anxiety, and myth. That arc is not a sign that the blood type is supernatural. It is a sign that human beings rarely leave inherited difference uninterpreted. There is strange humility in that conclusion. For much of this story, the temptation has been to inflate the trait into a revelation. But what makes ART-negative blood meaningful is not that it elevates its carriers above the species. It is that it reveals how much of the species' history is hidden inside ordinary biological variation. Human beings often imagine history as something external: ruins, dynasties, migrations, wars, famines, empires, coastlines redrawn by force. Yet blood reminds us that history also settles in quieter places. It settles in allele frequencies, in population patterns, in immunological risks, in family lines carrying traits no one understands until centuries later. The body is not separate from history. It is one of history's most intimate archives. And like any archive, it is easy to misread. That may be the deepest lesson of all. Negative blood becomes a magnet for myth not because the underlying science is empty, but because it is partial in the way all scientific knowledge is partial when detached from emotional context. Science can describe the antigen, it can explain sensitization, it can map distributions and reconstruct probable demographic pathways. But human beings do not only want mechanisms, they want meanings that feel equal to the emotional gravity of the subject. Birth, ancestry, hidden difference, family loss, survival, rarity. These are not cold topics. They are the very places where the mind most wants pattern, and where pattern most easily hardens into story. This is why the mythology around Rh-negative blood has always said as much about the storytellers as about the trait itself. In one age, people looked at inherited difference and saw divine descent. In another, noble purity or dangerous mixture. In the modern fringe imagination, they see alien ancestry, psychic sensitivity, forgotten bloodlines, concealed destinies. The vocabulary changes, but the impulse remains remarkably stable. The body seems too meaningful to be accidental. A rare inherited trait feels too intimate to be merely statistical. The result is a continuous effort to turn variation into revelation. Rh-negative blood is only one example, but it is an especially clear one because the science is solid enough to ground fascination, and the symbolism is old enough to amplify it. What survives through all these layers is the reality that human evolution is not neat. It is full of residues, asymmetries, survival through bottlenecks, expansion from small founder groups, repeated mixing interrupted by periods of relative isolation, and countless ordinary lives leaving cumulative traces in the gene pool. No single explanation fully accounts for every local frequency pattern, because no real population history is ever shaped by one thing alone. That complexity should not disappoint us. It should free us from the need for grand singular causes. The truth is already dramatic enough. Human beings move through ice ages, refugees, coastlines, valleys, and empires, and the blood quietly recorded some of it. There is also a moral clarity that comes from placing the subject back inside ordinary humanity. Special bloodline theories often flatter the few at the expense of the many. They suggest hidden rank, concealed superiority, or a deeper claim on meaning. But the real history of R negative blood points in a different direction. It shows shared vulnerability. It shows how one small difference in the bloodstream can matter profoundly in the wrong context, and how collective knowledge can reduce that danger. The important story is not that a minority blood type proves some people are more than human. The important story is that being human has always included invisible differences that require care, understanding, and, at times, social cooperation simply to manage safely. Nowhere is this more visible than in medicine. Blood donors, laboratory workers, obstetricians, nurses, researchers, and patients all become part of the same story. A rare blood type becomes not a private badge of cosmic distinction, but a reminder that compatibility is something societies must actively sustain. Blood banks must keep the right supplies, pregnancies must be monitored, preventive treatment must be available, knowledge must circulate clearly enough to displace fear. In this way, negative blood becomes a mirror of civilization itself. The risk it poses is not solved by myth, but by organization, trust, and applied understanding. That is a less glamorous answer than secret ancestry, yet it is far more consequential in actual human lives. The fascination does not disappear. Of course, it probably never will. Rarity will continue to seduce the imagination. New generations will continue to discover their blood type and wonder whether it says something hidden about them. Videos will continue to promise mysteries. Forums will continue to gather anecdotes into fragile theories. The internet will keep mixing rigorous information with suggestive folklore until the two blur at the edges. This is not because the truth is inaccessible. It is because mystery is one of the ways people defend meaning against the flatness of ordinary explanation. Negative blood will remain attractive precisely because it offers a scientifically real fact that still leaves emotional room for story. But perhaps the most mature response is not to choose cold fact over human wonder, or wonder over fact, but to hold them in the right proportion. The wonder belongs. It belongs in the realization that a tiny antigen can shape the fate of a pregnancy. It belongs in the discovery that population history leaves traces so subtle that only modern science can detect them. It belongs in the long arc by which an invisible danger becomes a preventable one. It belongs in the simple astonishment that the body contains hidden differences at all. What does not belong is the inflation of these differences into unsupported hierarchies or fantasies of superior origin. Wonder does not need false grandeur in order to survive. Seen clearly, or a negative blood becomes a lesson in scale. Small causes can have large consequences. Minor biological distinctions can accumulate into population patterns that look mysterious from a distance. Partial knowledge can generate myths that outlive correction. Ordinary demographic processes can produce results dramatic enough to seem designed, and the human longing to find identity in the body can transform even a modest medical label into a private cosmology. All of these things are true at once. The mystery is not that science has failed to explain the trait. The mystery is why explanation alone has never been enough to quiet the stories. Perhaps that is because blood still carries the ancient weight it always has. However advanced the laboratory becomes, blood remains tied to birth, injury, kinship, danger, sacrifice, and inheritance in the human imagination. It is the substance through which life seems to move most visibly and leave most abruptly. So when a rare difference is discovered inside it, people do what they have always done. They lean closer, they search for signs. They ask whether the body's trying to tell them something larger than biology. Most of the time biology is exactly what it is telling them. But biology, when it touches subjects this intimate, never arrives as only biology. And that is why negative blood matters beyond the clinic, not because it proves a secret hidden from science, but because it reveals how quickly human beings turn hidden variation into identity, fear, and myth. It exposes the ancient symbolic life still living beneath modern medicine. It shows how the body can become a screen for collective longing. It reminds us that survival often depends on differences too small to see, and on institutions careful enough to take those differences seriously. It also reminds us how much unnecessary grandeur we're willing to build around a fact simply because the fact is rare, inherited, and close to the deepest thresholds of life. So the final image is not of a chosen bloodline stepping out from the shadows of history. It is something quieter and, in its own way, more moving. A species learns, slowly, that it is internally more varied than it once believed. It discovers that those variations can wound, but also that they can be understood. It mistakes some of them for omens, then for conspiracies, then for signs of hidden ancestry. Yet through all of that, the actual blood keeps doing what it has always done, carrying oxygen, carrying risk, carrying the unnoticed signatures of countless generations. The trait remains rare, the stories remain large, and somewhere between the two, the human mind is reflected with unusual honesty, not as a keeper of secrets from other worlds, but as a maker of meaning, standing over one drop of blood and trying, as it always has, to read itself inside it. The longer this story is held in view, the quieter it becomes. At first it seems to promise a hidden kingdom of explanations, a rare blood type, an uneven map, an invisible inheritance, old losses in childbirth, strange modern theories. It is easy to see why so many people keep leaning toward it, hoping the body will open like a sealed room and reveal one final secret waiting inside. But the deeper truth is gentler than that, and perhaps more enduring. A negative blood does not finally lead outward to aliens, lost rulers, or some vanished order preserved in modern veins. It leads inward, into the ordinary strangeness of being human, into the fact that every body carries histories it cannot feel, into the fact that survival has always depended on delicate compatibilities no one knew how to name for most of our time on Earth, into the fact that populations wander, narrow, divide, recover, and leave behind small traces that later generations mistake for symbols because they do not yet know how else to read them. There is something almost tender in that mistake. People want blood to mean more because blood has always seemed too intimate to be random. It moves silently beneath the skin, unseen but essential, carrying life minute by minute without ceremony, when science reveals that it also carries hidden differences. The old imagination awakens immediately. It begins building stories again, as it always has. Some of those stories are beautiful. Some are dangerous. Most are simply human. And in the end, that may be enough. Not a grand revelation, but a clearer view of how people live with mystery. We inherit small things and make large meanings out of them. We discover mechanisms and still hunger for symbols. We learn that a tiny absent antigen can shape birth, grief, rescue, and memory. And even then we keep asking whether there is something more. Perhaps there always will be. So the last image is a quiet one, not a laboratory, not a conspiracy board, not a lost temple or a cosmic visitor, but a human body moving through time, carrying within it the residue of countless generations, a mother and child, a blood donor and a stranger, a family line crossing centuries without knowing exactly what travels with it, a red cell passing through the dark interior of the body, marked or unmarked by one small feature that no eye could ever see, yet which history, medicine, and imagination have all tried in their own ways to understand. The blood keeps moving, the stories gather around it, and somewhere between the two, the mystery remains, not because the answer is unreachable, but because human beings will always look at what sustains life most closely and feel, for a moment, that they are standing near something older than language, older than memory, and still not entirely finished with its work.